There is a small house at the edge of a river town, and in the small house there is a room, and in the room there is a fire that has been allowed to burn low. It is winter. Snow has been falling since the middle of the afternoon, the kind of snow that does not hurry. It comes down in wide, slow flakes as if it had all the time in the world and meant to use it. The window holds a little of the firelight and gives it back, so that the glass seems lit from within, and beyond the glass the street has gone quiet and white and soft at the corners. Inside, the air is warm and smells of wood smoke and of tea gone slightly cool in the pot. An old woman sits near the fire in a chair worn smooth by years of sitting. Her hands are folded in her lap and her eyes are half closed, and she's not asleep, though she's close to it, the way a person is close to sleep when there is nothing left in the day that needs doing. A clock somewhere in the house keeps the only steady sound, a small patient ticking that seems less like the marking of time than the breathing of the room itself. Now and then a log settles in the grate with a soft collapse, and a few sparks rise and wink out, and the woman does not stir. There is a second chair drawn up beside hers. It is the same kind of chair, old and comfortable and a little sunken in the seat, and it is empty just now, though it has the look of a chair that is used, a chair that belongs to someone. A shawl is folded over its back. A book lies face down on its arm, holding its place. The two chairs sit close together, angled toward the fire and toward each other, the way chairs come to sit when the people who use them have spent a great many evenings side by side and have stopped needing to say much. If you were to come in from the cold and stand in the doorway of that warm room, you might think you had wandered into the most ordinary scene in the world. An old woman, a low fire, snow at the glass, a kettle waiting to be filled. There is nothing here to suggest a fortune, nothing to suggest that 50 miles to the south there once stood a house so large that a person could become lost in it, with rooms that were never entered, and a staircase that climbed past floor after silent floor. There is nothing here to suggest that the woman by the fire was born into more money than most people in her century would ever see counted in one place. And there is certainly nothing to suggest that she had a sister, a twin in fact, born on the same night, in the same bed, of the same mother, 11 minutes apart. Two girls so alike at the start that the women who washed them had to tie a thread of red wool around one small wrist to tell them the one from the other. Two lives that began as a single line and then divided, the way a river divides around a stone, one branch carrying everything and one branch carrying almost nothing at all. But that is the story, and the story can wait. The fire is warm, the snow is falling, the clock is keeping its patient time. Let the old woman sit a while longer with her eyes half closed, and let the second chair stay as it is, ready. There is no hurry tonight, and there will be no hurry in any of this. We are going back now, gently, the way you might turn back through the pages of a book you have read before, to a night long ago when the snow was also falling, and two cries went up in the dark, one after the other, into a house that did not yet know what it was about to do. The family was called Hartwell, and the name once meant something along a particular stretch of the Hudson, the way a name can mean something in a place without anyone quite remembering why. It meant mills, first of all. It meant a long, low building of dark stone set against a falling river, where wool came in raw and went out woven, and where the water turned a wheel that turned the whole machinery of a family's rising. It meant smoke standing straight up on still mornings. It meant the sound of looms, which is a sound like rain heard from inside a house, steady and many-fingered, going on beneath everything else. But that was the beginning, and the man who began it did not stay at the beginning long. His name was Josiah Hartwell, and he had come into the valley as a young man with very little, and he had looked at the river and the falling water, and the cheap land beside it the way some men look at a horse they intend to buy, seeing not what it was but what it would become. He bought the land. He built the mill. He did not spend the money the mill made. He turned it into more mills, and then into the rail line that carried what the mills produced, and then into the land the rail line ran across, and then into more land still, until the meaning of the Hartwell name had grown far past wool, and become something harder to hold in the mind, a web of deeds and leases and shares that reached down the river and into the city itself. It was the age for such men. The country had come out of its long war and turned, with a kind of fever, toward the making of money, and there had perhaps never been a time better suited to a patient, watchful, untrusting sort of man who wanted only to accumulate and never to let go. Fortunes rose in those decades like buildings, faster than anyone could quite believe, and a few of them rose so high that the men who built them began to seem less like men than like weather, forces that happened to the rest of the world. Josiah Hartwell was never quite so large as that, but in his own valley, and in the counting houses of the city where his name was known, he was large enough. He built a house to match the fortune because that was expected, though it never seemed to give him much pleasure. It stood above the river on a rise of ground, a great pile of grey stone with tall windows and a roofline broken by gables and chimneys, and it had a name of its own, which the family used and the servants used, and which the valley people used with a faint dry turn of the mouth. They called it Hartwell's Reach. From its upper windows you could see the river going by, wide and slow, and the colour of pewter under cloud, and you could see on a clear day the blue shoulders of the mountains on the far side, and a person standing at those windows might have felt that a great deal of the visible world belonged to the family that owned the glass. Inside, the house was cool and dim and faintly grand in a way that did not invite you to sit down. There were rooms for everything and rooms for nothing, a room only for receiving morning callers, and a room only for the long dinners that were given a few times a year and otherwise stood dark. There were carpets so good they were walked around rather than on. There was a clock in the hall as tall as a man, with a slow brass pendulum the size of a dinner plate, and its tick filled the lower floor the way water fills a cistern, patient and cold. The house was warm only in a few of its corners, and only when someone had taken the trouble, and it learned its mistress's habits early and held them long after she was gone. Josiah Hartwell had one son, and the son was not made of the same iron as the father. His name was Edward, and he was gentle, and his lungs were never strong, and he had the kind of fine, tired good looks that the people of that time admired in the young and worried about quietly among themselves. Edward married a young woman named Frances, who came from an old and respectable family with very little money left in it, which suited Josiah well enough, since it meant she came without grand ideas of her own. Frances was quiet and watchful and kinder than the house she'd married into, and when she was carried up to one of the cold, grand bedrooms to have her first child, no one yet knew that there would be two. That is where the story truly begins, on a night near the end of a hard winter, in a house that valued nothing so much as the keeping whole of what it had. For the great fact of Josiah Hartwell, the fact that ran under everything he did the way the river ran under the valley, was this: he could not bear the thought of his fortune being divided. He had watched other great fortunes melt in a single generation, split among sons and daughters and their husbands, and their debts until nothing remained but a good name and a closing house, and the thought filled him with a dread that was almost religious. A fortune split, to his mind, was a fortune killed. And so he had made up his mind, long before there were any grandchildren at all, that whatever he had built would pass down one line only, whole and unbroken, to a single pair of hands. In an older country, in an older century, such a wish might have been ordinary, even lawful. There were lands across the sea where the eldest child took everything by long custom, and the rest took what kindness allowed. But this was not that country, and it was not that century. Here the law had set its face against such things long ago, and divided estates fairly among children as a matter of course, and a man who wished to leave everything to one child, and nothing to another, had to do it on purpose. With a lawyer at his elbow and his own hand on the pen, he had to choose. Josiah Hartwell intended to choose. He simply did not yet know that the night ahead would hand him two grandchildren where he had expected one, and ask him to choose between them. So this is a story about choosing, and about the things that are decided for us before we are old enough to know we are being decided about. It is a story about two sisters who began as one, and about a fortune that one of them would carry like a crown, and the other would never touch at all. It is a story with a great house in it, and a small house in it, and a long life lived inside walls, and a long life lived among people, and a question that hangs over all of it, without ever quite being asked aloud until the very end, when there is no one left to ask it of but the fire. We will get there slowly. There is no part of it that needs to be rushed. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The snow had been falling on Hartwell's Reach since before dark, and by the time the pains began in earnest, it had thickened into something steady and serious, blurring the lamps along the drive into soft halos and laying itself over the gardens until the shapes of the hedges were lost. The river below the house had gone invisible. swallowed into the general white, and the only proof it was still there was the cold that came up off it and pressed against the tall windows. Inside, in one of the upper bedrooms, a fire had been built higher than the household usually allowed, and the room was warm and close, and smelled of camphor and clean linen and the particular green sharpness of the herbs the midwife had set steeping in a basin. Frances Hartwell lay in the great bed with its carved posts and its hangings of dark wool, and she breathed the way she had been told to breathe, and she watched the firelight move on the ceiling between the long, slow climbs of the pane. She was not afraid, or not only afraid. She was a young woman in a house that had never quite warmed to her, and she had understood for some months that the child she carried would matter to that house, in a way she herself did not, and she had made a private peace with this. Whatever was coming, it would be hers first. For a few hours, before the house took it and made it into an heir, it would belong to her alone. The midwife was a broad, calm woman from the village who had brought half the valley into the world and buried a fair number of them too, and she moved about the room without hurry, warming cloths, murmuring the small encouragements that mean nothing and everything. A maid came and went with water. Somewhere below in the cold grand rooms, Edward Hartwell sat by a fire he kept feeding without noticing, listening to the house above him, and unable to do anything but listen, and somewhere further off in his study, old Josiah sat with a single lamp and a ledger he was not reading, waiting for the news that would tell him the future of everything he had made. The first child came near to midnight in the last hour of a long day, and she came with a good strong cry that filled the room and seemed to push back against the silence of the great house. The midwife caught her and turned her and wiped her clean, and Frances, lifting her head from the pillow, saw a small, red, furious face and a tuft of dark, wet hair, and she felt the thing that mothers feel, and that no one has ever been able to put properly into words. A girl! The midwife wrapped her and laid her on her mother's breast, and the cry softened into the small working sounds of a creature learning the new fact of air. And then the midwife's face changed. She had set her hand on Frances again out of habit, and the habit had told her something, and she leaned in and felt more carefully and went very still. There was another. She said it quietly, almost to herself, and then she said it again so that Frances would understand, and the warm, close room rearranged itself around the words. Twins. No one had expected twins. There had been no sign of it that anyone had read rightly, and in that age there was no way to have known for certain beforehand, and so the second child arrived as a true surprise, the way the most ordinary miracles tend to. The second girl came 11 minutes after the first in the new hour, on what was by then a different day, for midnight had passed between them. She was smaller, and her cry was thinner, and she had to be coaxed and rubbed before she found her voice. But find it she did. And the two cries went up together in the firelit room, twined and indistinguishable, two small lives announcing themselves to a house that had been braced for one. The midwife laughed, a short surprised laugh with something like wonder in it, and Frances held both her daughters and wept without quite knowing whether it was from joy or from a fear she could not yet name. When the children had been cleaned and settled, a difficulty arose that seems almost too small to matter, and yet would shadow everything that came after. They were alike. Not merely sisters alike, but alike in the deep way that only certain twins are alike, with the same shape of head and the same fold of ear and the same dark down of hair, so that even Frances, looking from one to the other in the unsteady firelight, could not have sworn which she had held first. The midwife, practical as ever, took a length of soft red wool from her basket and tied it loosely around the wrist of the elder, the one who had come before midnight, so that there would be no confusion about which child was which. A thread of red wool. That was all it took in the beginning to mark the difference between everything and nothing. Word went down through the house the way warmth never quite did, quickly and into every corner. The maid told the cook, and the cook told the man who tended the furnace, and within the hour the whole of the lower staff knew that the young mistress had been brought to bed of two daughters, and they said it to one another in the low, pleased voices people use for good news that is also somehow complicated. Edward was brought up and shown his children, and he sat on the edge of the great bed holding one in the crook of each arm, looking from face to face with an expression his wife had never seen on him before. Soft and dazzled and a little frightened, and for that hour at least the question of fortune did not enter the room. But it entered the house. Down in his study, old Josiah heard the news from the housekeeper, who delivered it standing very straight with her hands folded, as she delivered everything. 2 girls. He did not say anything for a moment. He set down the pen he had not been writing with and looked at the lamp, and the housekeeper who had served him a long time and knew the weathers of his silence waited. 2 girls, and no boy, and 2 where he had counted on 1. A lesser part of him, the part that was simply a grandfather and an old man at the end of a long life, felt a small, unexpected warmth. The greater part of him, the part that had built everything and could not stop building, had already begun, quietly and without cruelty and without quite meaning to do arithmetic. For the fact of 2 children where he had planned for one did not change his oldest intention, it only sharpened it. A fortune divided was a fortune killed. He had believed that for 50 years, and he was not a man to be argued out of a thing he had believed for 50 years by the accident of an extra grandchild. If anything, the arrival of 2 daughters where the line might so easily have produced a single heir struck him as a kind of test, a thing sent to see whether he had the resolve to hold to his principle, even when holding to it meant setting one small life above another. He believed he had the resolve. He had never lacked it before. Upstairs none of this had yet arrived. Upstairs there was only the warm room and the low fire and a young woman with 2 sleeping daughters and a husband whose chest, even now, even in his happiness, gave the small dry catch that frightened her more than she let him see. Frances looked at the red thread on the small wrist and thought it a homely, kindly thing, a midwife's trick, nothing more. It did not occur to her that it marked an order, a first and a second, a before and an after. It did not occur to her that anyone would ever care which of her daughters had drawn breath in the old day, and which in the new. They were hers, both of them, equally and entirely, and in the firelight they looked so nearly the same that the difference of 11 minutes seemed the least real thing about them. She named them herself, which was perhaps the last large thing the house allowed her to decide. She named the elder Adelaide, a long handsome name that she had always liked the sound of, a name with a little ceremony in it, and she named the younger Esther, which was plainer and older, and came out of the worn family Bible that had crossed with her own people through hard times, a name she loved for reasons she could not have explained, except that it felt warm in the mouth and steady, the kind of name a person could lean on, Adelaide and Esther. She said them over to herself in the dark as the fire burned down, trying them, liking the way they sat side by side, not knowing that she had named a crown and a freedom and could not have said which was which. The christening came some weeks later, in the cold stone church the family kept a pew in, and it was a grander affair than the occasion strictly required, because Josiah Hartwell did nothing by halves where the family's standing was concerned, even the things that did not interest him. The 2 babies were carried in under a great deal of white lace, and held over the old font while the words were said, and they behaved well on the whole, and the valley people who had crowded into the back of the church to see craned their necks and whispered that you could not tell the one from the other, which was true, and that it must be a strange and lovely thing to be a twin, which was also, in its way, true. Afterward there was a gathering at the house, and the babies were brought down and shown and passed carefully, from one pair of admiring arms to another, and the red wool had by then been replaced with a small bracelet of coral on Adelaide's wrist, coral being thought in those days to guard an infant from harm, so that even the protective charm was given to the elder, and not the younger, though no one remarked on it, and no one meant anything by it. It was simply easier to mark one than both. It was simply the way the small decisions fell, and the small decisions in that house had a way of falling always in the same direction, like snow off a sloped roof, all of it sliding quietly toward one side. Frances watched the afternoon from a chair by the window, still weak, wrapped in a shawl, and she saw her father-in-law cross the room to where the elder child was being held, and she saw him look down at the small sleeping face for a long moment, with an expression she could not read. He did not touch the baby. He did not coo or smile the way the others did. He simply looked, the way a man looks at a thing he has decided to be responsible for, and then he straightened and moved away, and went to look more briefly at the other. Frances told herself she had imagined the difference in the 2 looks. For a long time afterward she went on telling herself that. The winter let go its grip slowly as it does in that country, with false springs and late hard frosts, and the river came back to itself and ran high and brown with melt, and the looms started their long rain sound again down in the mills. The 2 babies grew, and slept, and woke, and were carried out into the first mild days wrapped against a cold that was loosening at last, and Frances, walking the gravel paths of the garden with a nurse on either side and a child in each set of arms, felt for a while almost happy. She had 2 daughters. They were well. They were alike as 2 halves of an apple. Whatever shadow she had felt in the christening church had surely been only her own tiredness, the long fear of the birth still draining out of her. But she had married into a house that kept its intentions the way it kept its money, quietly and for a long time, and she did not know yet how patient such a house could be. The decision had been made, or as good as made, in the first hour of the children's lives by an old man alone with a lamp doing arithmetic he would never need to write down. It would not be spoken of for years. It would simply be there, under everything, the way the river was under the valley, shaping the ground without ever showing itself, until one day the children were old enough for it to begin, very gently to surface. For now, though, there were only the 2 of them, indistinguishable in their long white gowns, lying head to head in the same wide cradle, because they slept better that way and cried when they were parted. The nurse would lay them down at evening with the lamp turned low, and they would find each other's hands in their sleep, the way they had lain together before they were born, and the room would go quiet, and outside the last of the snow would be melting off the gables and dropping now and then with a soft heavy sound onto the gravel below. 2 small lives that had begun as one, 11 minutes between them, and a whole world waiting very patiently to put that 11 minutes to use. A great house is a kind of animal, and Hartwell's Reach was an animal that did not like to be touched. It liked to be kept. There is a difference, and the children learned it before they could have named it, the way children learn the temper of a place through the soles of their feet and the backs of their hands. There were surfaces in that house that were polished, and surfaces that were dusted, and surfaces that were left alone, and there were rooms you passed through, and rooms you sat in, and rooms whose doors stayed shut from one season's end to the next, holding their cold air and their shrouded furniture in a patient dark. To grow up in such a house was to learn an invisible map of permissions, and to carry it always, and to feel the small wrongness in your chest when you strayed across one of its lines. The mornings began long before the family woke, down in the parts of the house the family rarely saw. While the upper rooms still held their night quiet, the lower regions were already astir, for a house of that size ran on the early labour of a good many people who were paid to be invisible. The kitchen maid was up first in the cold dark, raking out the great range and laying it fresh and coaxing the fire to take, and the smell of that first fire of ash and coal and the faint sweetness of kindling was the true beginning of every Hartwell day, though no one upstairs ever smelled it. By the time the family stirred, the house had been warmed and swept and set in order by hands they would not see, and the work of the morning had already been going on for hours, like the river, like the looms beneath the surface of things. The light in the house was gaslight in those years, and it gave the rooms a particular character that the children would remember all their lives and miss without knowing they missed it. It was a soft, breathing, faintly hissing light, a little gold, a little green at its edges, and it threw shadows that wavered and were never quite still, so that a room at evening seemed always on the point of moving. It smelled, very faintly the way gaslight smells, and that smell mixed with the smells of the house itself, of beeswax and old wood, and the cold stone of the halls and the particular dry scent of the carpets, into something that was simply the smell of home, the smell that means safety to a child long before the child has any idea what safety costs. Into this house the 2 girls came up out of the nursery, in the slow way that children of such families were brought up out of the nursery, by stages and on a schedule. For the first years they belonged to the upper floor, to the bright plain rooms under the roof where the nurse ruled, and the rules were gentler, and the furniture was made to be climbed on. The nursery was the warmest part of Hartwell's Reach, by long custom, for even a house that grudged its warmth would not grudge it to the heir, and the heir, after all, was up there somewhere among the 2 of them. There was a fire kept all day, and a guard around it, and a rug worn soft by the knees of generations of small Hartwells, and a window that looked out over the kitchen garden and the orchard, and beyond them the long silver reach of the river that had given the house its name. They were, in those years, almost a single creature. People who had twins in the family understood it, and people who did not were forever remarking on it. But the plain fact was that Adelaide and Esther did not experience themselves as 2 separate beings so much as one being with 2 bodies, and they moved through the nursery world in a kind of doubled motion, each always half aware of where the other was. They learned to speak late, the nurse said, because they had less need of it. A great deal of what passed between them passed without words, in glances and small touches and the wordless private language that such pairs invent and then forget they have invented. At night they were put into separate small beds, for that was thought proper, and at night they got out of the separate small beds and into one, and were found in the morning curled together like a pair of question marks, and after a while the nurse stopped fighting it. It was the nurse, more than anyone, who shaped those early years, a woman named Hannah who had come to the house before the children were born, and would stay long after they had outgrown her. She was not a soft woman exactly, but she was a steady one, and steadiness in a child's life is a kind of love whether or not it ever calls itself by that name. She did not play favourites, or did not mean to. She would have said, if asked, that she loved the two of them just the same, and she would have believed it. But the house worked on Hannah as it worked on everyone, and there were small things, a coral bracelet kept on one wrist, a particular chair always given to one child at the table, a habit of naming Adelaide first in every sentence that named them both, that crept into her care without her ever deciding on them, the way water finds the lowest ground. The girls did not notice. Why would they have? A child takes the world as it is given and assumes that the shape of it is simply the shape of the world. And to Adelaide and Esther, the world was the nursery and the garden in each other, and in that world they were entirely equal. Two halves of one whole, sharing everything, hiding nothing, fighting and forgiving in the quick, complete way of small children who have never once doubted that they belong to each other. If Adelaide was given the larger slice or named the first or set in the warmer seat, neither of them weighed it, because the idea of weighing such things had not yet been put into their heads. That would come later, and it would come from outside the way most of the hard ideas of childhood come. The seasons turned over the house the way they turn over any house, but they turned more visibly there because the house was so much a part of its land. In summer the windows of the nursery stood open, and the smell of cut hay came up from the meadows, and the bees worked the flowers under the wall, and the river ran low and warm, and the children were taken down to wade at its quiet edge, while a maid watched from the bank. In autumn the orchard filled the lower garden with the heavy cidery smell of windfall apples, and the kitchen below went into its long siege of preserving, and the whole house took on a sweetness of cooking fruit and hot sugar that even the cold halls could not entirely refuse. The children would stand at the head of the kitchen stair, where they were not supposed to be, and breathe it in. And in winter the house drew into itself, as that house always did. The shut rooms grew colder. The lived-in rooms grew smaller around their fires. The snow came down over the gardens, and the river vanished into white, and the great clock in the hall ticked through the long afternoons that came on dark by 4. Those were the best times in a way for the two girls, because winter pressed the family closer together than any other season did, and there were evenings, not many but enough to remember, when they were brought down to the warm end of a warm room and allowed to sit on the floor near the grown people, and the lamplight was gold, and Hannah's knitting needles ticked along with the clock, and for an hour the great cold house felt almost like a small warm one. Their father, Edward, was a presence at the edges of those years, loved and a little unreal, the way a parent is unreal to a child who sees him in glimpses. He was often unwell, and when he was unwell he kept to his own rooms, and the girls learned to read the house's weather by whether his door was open or shut and by the faces of the servants who came and went from it. But when he was well he was the gentlest thing in their world, far gentler than the house deserved, and he would take them on his knees, one to a knee, and tell them stories that wandered and lost their way and did not much matter, because what mattered was the rumble of his voice, through his thin chest and the smell of his coat, and the rare unhurried fact of his attention. They did not know that the catch in his breathing was a clock of its own, counting down. They only knew that he was there less than they wished. Their grandfather was a different kind of presence, rarer and colder and harder to love, though they tried, because children will try to love whatever they are told to honour. Old Josiah moved through the house like its weather, and where he passed, voices dropped and backs straightened, and the two girls felt the change in the air before they saw him, and learned to be very still. He was not cruel to them. He never struck them or shouted at them or said a hard word in their hearing. But he looked at them in a way that was not the way the others looked at them, a measuring way, a way that seemed to be adding something up, and Esther, who was the more watchful of the two from very early, felt his look differently than Adelaide did, though it would be years before she found any words for the difference. For there was a difference by then in the way the house held its breath around the two of them, though it was still so faint that only a child's animal sense could catch it. When the grandfather came into the nursery, which was seldom, his eye went first to Adelaide and rested there, and his few words were for her, and Esther stood a little apart in those moments without being told to, having learned, the way one learns the temper of a place, that this was how the moment was shaped. She did not resent it. She was 4, and then 5, and then 6, and she had no framework for resentment. She simply absorbed the shape of things as children do, and stored it somewhere below thought, where it would wait. The mills went on below all of this, out of sight and mostly out of mind, but their sound reached the house on the right wind, the long soft rain sound of the looms, and the children grew up with it the way children near the sea grow up with the sound of the sea, hearing it without hearing it, so that years later a sudden quiet, a day when the mills were stopped, would feel stranger and more alarming than any noise. The money the mills made reached the house too, though even less visibly than the sound, in the form of a kind of weightless ease, the ease of a household where the lamps were always filled and the fires always laid, and the table always set and no one ever once spoke, in front of the children, of what any of it cost. To want for nothing, and to never hear money mentioned, is its own peculiar education, and the girls received it without knowing they were being taught. And yet, for all its grandeur, the house was not a happy one, and the girls knew this too, in the wordless way they knew everything in those years. There was a heaviness in it that the lamplight could not lift, a sense of waiting, of holding on, of guarding something that was never named, and it came down, they would understand much later, from the old man in his study with his ledgers and his lamp, and it had spread into the very stones. A child raised in such a house learns to be careful without knowing why, to keep her voice down and her wants small and her real self a little bit hidden, and both girls learned this, but Esther learned it more deeply, because the house, for reasons she could not have explained, asked more of it from her. They had each other, though, and that was the thing that made those years sweet despite the cold of the house, despite the grandfather, despite the gathering shadow none of them could see. They had the long shared days and the doubled play and the private language and the warm tangle of the shared bed at night. They had 1,000 small treaties and conspiracies, the hidden things children keep from grown people, made richer by the fact that there were 2 of them to keep them. If one was scolded, the other felt it. If one was praised, the other glowed. They had not yet been taught to be separate, and so they were not separate. And the years of not being separate were, though they did not know it, the happiest either of them would ever have. On the clearest winter nights, when the household had gone to bed, and the great clock ticked alone in the hall below, the 2 girls would sometimes climb out of their bed and go together to the cold nursery window and look out at the snow. The garden lay white and blue under the moon, and the river was a paler ribbon in the dark, and the far mountains stood black against a sky thick with stars, and the 2 small figures in their nightgowns would stand close together with their breath fogging the glass, not saying much, because they did not need to. The house slept around them, vast and cold and full of its silent intentions, and held them, for a little while longer, exactly the same. Then the cold would drive them back, and they would burrow again into the warm shared bed, and find each other's hands and sleep. For a while there was 2 of everything, and the 2 girls took it as the natural order of the world. 2 cups at the nursery table, the same blue, the same chip on neither or both. 2 coats hung on 2 pegs, 2 pairs of small boots set side by side to dry, 2 dolls with the same painted faces given on the same birthday, so that there could be no question of one being finer than the other. Frances saw to this quietly and steadily in the years she had left. Whatever the house intended, she had decided that her daughters would grow up matched, and she spent a good part of her small private will on the keeping of that balance, buying in 2s, dividing in halves, naming them as often Esther and Adelaide as Adelaide and Esther, so that the order would not always fall the same way in the children's ears. It is worth dwelling on her, this quiet mother, because she was the one true counterweight in those early years to the long patient leaning of the house, and because she did not last. Frances had married into Hartwell's reach without illusions and had made the best of it, and her best, where her daughters were concerned, was considerable. She could not change the old man's mind. She may not even have known in any settled way what was in the old man's mind. But she could keep her girls equal under her own eye, and she did, fiercely and without fuss, and the years in which she did it were the years in which Adelaide and Esther were happiest and most alike, and the two facts are not unconnected. She taught them their letters herself at first at a small table by the morning-room window, the two dark heads bent together over the same slate, and she made a game of it, and never once let either of them feel slower or quicker than the other. She taught them their stitches, the long patient apprenticeship of the needle that every girl of their station served, and here they did begin to differ, but only as any two children differ. Adelaide's stitches were neat and even, and a little impatient to be done, and Esther's were slower and fonder, with a feeling for the cloth that her sister did not share. Frances noticed this, and said nothing, and kept the two samplers side by side on the wall, the neat one and the loving one equal in their frame. But Frances grew tired in those years, with a tiredness that did not lift between seasons the way ordinary tiredness does. She had never been strong since the birth, and the house was cold to her in more ways than one, and her husband's slow decline took a toll on her that she let no one see. She began to keep to her room in the afternoons. The morning lessons grew shorter, and then less regular, and then they passed into other hands, and the small balanced world she had built for her daughters began, very gently, to come apart, because there was no one else who thought to keep it balanced. The house did not. The house leaned, as it had always leaned, and with Frances fading there was less and less to lean against. The first real sign came in the matter of the schooling, when the girls were 7. It was decided by the grandfather that the time had come for a proper governess, and a governess was duly engaged, a thin, precise woman named Miss Ames, who arrived with 2 trunks and a great many opinions and took up residence in a room near the schoolroom. And it was Miss Ames who, without any cruelty, simply following the instruction she had been given, began for the first time to teach the 2 girls differently. For the grandfather had given instructions. Adelaide, he had let it be understood, was to be prepared for responsibilities. Esther was to be given a sound and pleasant education, suitable to a young lady. The words sound very near each other. The lives they shaped grew very far apart. So the school days divided. There were hours when the 2 girls learned together still, their French and their music and their drawing and the long histories of kings, and those hours felt like the old days and were treasured for it. But there came to be other hours, set aside, when Adelaide was taken alone into the grandfather's part of the house, and Esther was left in the schoolroom with a book and the window. Adelaide did not know, at first, what those hours were for, only that they were solemn and a little frightening, and that she was praised for sitting through them, and Esther did not know what they were either, only that her sister came back from them quieter, with a new weight on her, and that something had begun to happen to Adelaide that was not happening to her. What was happening was that the grandfather had begun to make the heir. He was an old man by then, and he knew his time was not unlimited, and he had a great deal to pour into a single vessel before he went. So he had Adelaide brought to him, and he taught her in his cold, patient way the things he believed an heir must know. He showed her the maps of the family lands, the long unrolling sheets with their inked boundaries, and made her trace the holdings with her finger until she knew them. He told her, in words a child could just hold, about rents and leases and the patient keeping of what one had. He told her, again and again, the one great commandment of his life, that what had been gathered must never be divided, that to split a fortune was to kill it, that her whole duty when her time came would be to keep the thing whole. Adelaide was 7, and then 8, and she sat through these sessions because she was told to, and because, in a hungry corner of her child's heart, she was glad of the attention, glad to be the one chosen for something, glad that the cold old man who frightened the whole house had a use for her, and a softness, of a kind, in his eye when he looked at her. She did not understand that she was being filled like a vessel and sealed. She only understood that she was special, and being special is a sweet thing to a child, sweet enough to swallow a great deal of cold along with it. She did not see the cage, she saw the crown, and reached for it, the way any child would. And Esther, in the schoolroom with her book and her window, did not understand what she was being spared. She felt only the loss of her sister's company for those hours, and a confused ache that she could not have explained, a sense that there was a room she was not allowed into, and a future she was not being made for. She was a watchful child, watchful as she had been from the cradle, and she watched her sister change, watched the weight settle on her, and felt, underneath her loneliness, a faint guilty relief that she did not examine. The grown people did not bring her into the cold, solemn room. The grandfather's measuring eye, when it found her, slid off again quickly, as if there were nothing in her that needed measuring. She told herself this did not hurt. She was wrong about that, but she was very young, and the telling was easier than the truth. Their mother died in the spring of the girl's 12th year, quietly, in the way she'd done most things. She'd been failing for so long that the end, when it came, seemed less an event than a settling, a candle that had been guttering at last going out. The house went into its mourning with all the heavy correctness such houses kept. The mirrors covered, the clock stopped at the hour of death, the knocker muffled, the servants in black, the long crape hung at the door. The two girls were dressed in black and stood at the graveside between the cold spring wind and the colder grandfather, and they held hands so tightly that the bones ached, because they understood, without anyone telling them, that they had just lost the one person who had kept them equal, and that there was no one left now to stand between them and whatever the house intended. After the mother was gone, the leaning of the house grew open, or open enough that even a child could read it. There was no longer a counterweight, no longer a quiet, steady will buying in twos and dividing in halves, and so the small distinctions multiplied and hardened. Adelaide was given the better room when the girls were moved out of the shared nursery into rooms of their own. It faced the river, and it was warmer, and it was understood, without being said, that this was as it should be. Adelaide's clothes came to be made of slightly better stuff. Adelaide was the one consulted, in the small ways a child can be consulted, about the running of things, and Esther was the one whose preferences were asked after kindly and then quietly set aside. None of it was cruel, all of it pointed one way. The strange thing, the thing that kept the bond from breaking even then, was that neither girl wanted what was happening. Adelaide did not enjoy her grandfather's solemn rooms. She would have given the better bedroom, and the better clothes, and the measuring approval gladly for one more afternoon of the old equal play. And Esther did not, in any simple way, envy her sister, because she could see, even then, that the things being heaped on Adelaide were heavy things, cold things, and that her sister was being made smaller and stiffer by them, not larger. They were being pulled apart by a force that neither of them had chosen, and neither of them welcomed, and they knew it, and they clung to each other against it in the hours they were allowed, and for a long time the clinging held. At night still, despite the separate rooms, they found their way back to one bed as often as not, padding along the cold corridor in the dark to be together, and there, in the dark, they were equal again, just two girls who had lost their mother and were frightened of the great house, and of the future, and of the cold old man who shaped it. They whispered. They made the old small treaties. Adelaide would tell Esther what she had learned in the solemn rooms, the maps and the rents, and the commandment about never dividing, and Esther would listen, and a picture began to form in both their minds, dim and enormous, of a thing called the fortune, a thing that was coming toward them out of the future, and that was somehow going to land on Adelaide and not on her and change everything. They did not know how to feel about it, and so they decided in one of their whispered midnight treaties not to let it matter. They were twins. They would always have each other. Whatever fell to Adelaide would be shared, because everything had always been shared. And what was the fortune but a larger version of the slice of cake or the new doll, to be cut down the middle as a matter of course? They promised each other this, in the dark, in the simple, absolute way that children promise things, and they believed it utterly, and the belief comforted them, and they slept. They were too young to know that some things cannot be cut down the middle, and that the very heart of the fortune, the thing that defined it, was that it could never, ever be shared. The grandfather, had he heard that midnight promise, would not have been angry. He would have been almost sorry in his cold way, for he did not hate the younger child, and took no pleasure in what he was doing to her. He simply held a principle above persons, as such men do, and the principle required that one of these two be given everything and the other nothing, and the only question the principle left open was which. He had answered that question in the first hour of their lives, on the evidence of 11 minutes and a thread of red wool, and nothing he had seen in the years since had moved him to reconsider. The elder was the elder. The thing must pass whole. There was a kind of terrible simplicity in it, and the simplicity was its own argument, and he was not a man troubled by arguments once he had let the simple ones win. And so the two girls came up through their childhood like a single plant that has been staked to grow two ways, gently and steadily trained apart, one branch toward the warm wall and the sun, one branch toward the open air and the weather, neither of them yet understanding that the staking would hold, that the shapes being set in them now would set for good. They still reached for each other across the widening space. They still met in the dark, but the space was widening, a little each year, under the patient hand of the house, and there would come a day, not far off now, when the staking was done and the choice that had been made in secret would be spoken aloud, and the two branches would find that they had grown too far apart to be brought back to one. That day was coming, but it had not come yet, and the nights for now were still shared. There was a glass room at the side of the house, built onto it in the years when such things were the fashion, a conservatory of iron ribs and many small panes, where the family kept its oranges and its ferns and its forced bulbs through the cold months. It was the warmest room at Hartwell's Reach, warmer even than the old nursery, for it had its own stove fed all winter to keep the green things from dying, and it smelled of earth and of leaf and of the faint sweetness of whatever was in bloom, and the light came through the glass in a soft watery way that was kind to everything it fell on. It was, by a kind of unspoken agreement, Esther's room, the one place in the great house that seemed to belong to her, and she spent the long afternoons of her girlhood there among the plants, while her sister was being made into something else entirely. For by the time the two were 15, 16, the divergence that had begun as a difference of school hours had become a difference of whole days, whole selves. Adelaide was being made into a lady of consequence, which was a heavy and exacting trade. There were the hours with the grandfather still, the maps and the ledgers and the cold commandments, but there were new hours now too, hours of a different kind of training, for it had been decided that the heir to the Hartwell fortune must take her place in the world, must be presentable, must be able to hold a drawing-room and an evening and a name. So there came dancing masters and a teacher of deportment and long fittings for clothes that cost more than a mill hand earned in a year, and Adelaide stood through all of it, straight-backed and weary, learning to be looked at. Esther was given none of this, and at first the want of it was simply another loss, another door she was not led through. There was no dancing master for her, no deportment, no costly fittings, for what would be the point? She was the younger, the unprovided, the one who would have to make a quiet, useful life somewhere on the edges of the world, and the world did not require that such a person be polished. And yet, in the way that the unwatched come into a freedom the watched never know, Esther found that the doors she was not led through opened onto rooms of her own. While her sister was learning to be looked at, Esther was learning to look. While her sister was being shaped for the drawing-room, Esther had the run of the conservatory and the kitchen and the garden and the whole green unbothered life of the place, and she filled herself with it. She came to know the gardener, an old slow man named Pruitt, who'd been at the Reach longer than the grandfather's money, and who treated the younger Hartwell girl with a gruff equality he showed no one else, perhaps because he sensed she would never be anyone's mistress and so could be spoken to plainly. He taught her the names of things and the times of things, when to set the bulbs and when to lift them, how to take a slip from a geranium and coax it into a new plant, how to read the weather off the river. There was a great deal of patience in what he taught, and a great deal of tenderness towards small living things, and Esther, who had been quietly set aside by the human world of the house, poured a good part of her young heart into the green one, and it answered her, as the green world will. She came to know the kitchen too, which a young lady of the house was not supposed to do, and the cook, a wide-warm tyrant named Mrs. Dell, who ruled the lower regions, suffered her to sit by the great range and watch and, in time, to help, in a way she would never have suffered the elder girl, the heir, the one the whole enterprise was for. Esther learned the smell of bread at its different stages, the way the kitchen filled with it, and the way you could tell by the smell alone when the loaves were near done. She learned to whip and to fold and to wait, and she learned the easy rough talk of the servants' hall, the gossip and the grumbling and the kindness underneath, and she came to be, among those people, something she could never be among her own, which was simply welcome. And she had her music, which was the one accomplishment the house did not begrudge her, because music was thought a proper thing for any young lady to have, even a poor one, and so Esther was allowed her hours at the piano in the cold drawing-room, and she took to them as her sister never had. Adelaide played, of course. Adelaide had been taught, and played correctly the way she did everything, with a competence that satisfied the requirements, and pleased no one, least of all herself. but Esther played as if the instrument were a person she was talking to, and the cold drawing room would warm a little around her playing, and the servants would pause in the hall to listen, and even old Josiah, passing the door, was known to stop once or twice, and stand a moment and then move on without a word. So the two young women grew, and the world would have said, looking at them, that the elder was the fortunate one and the younger the pitiable, and the world would have been looking only at the surfaces. For Adelaide, in those years of her making, was being slowly emptied of her own wants and filled with the wants of the house, until she could scarcely have told you, by the time she was 18, what she herself liked, what she herself would have chosen, had choosing ever been allowed her. And Esther, in those same years, neglected and unprovided and unwatched, was filling up with herself, with her green knowledge and her warm kitchens and her music that talked, becoming, in her quiet, sidelong way, a person while her sister was becoming a position. They felt the difference between them now, both of them, and it was harder than it had been. They were old enough to understand what was coming, old enough to have heard, in the indirect way such things are let drop, the shape of their two futures, and the understanding put a sorrow into their love for each other that had not been there in the simple days. Adelaide would look at Esther's freedom and feel, beneath her sisterly affection, a thin, cold thread of something she was ashamed of, which was envy of the very poverty she was supposed to pity. And Esther would look at her sister's grandeur and feel, beneath her affection, a thread of the same, and each of them, sensing the other's hidden envy, drew back a little, and the drawing back grieved them, because they did not want it, and could not seem to stop it. There was a season, when they were 18, that brought the difference to a point. It was decided that Adelaide should be brought out, should be presented to the society of the city as the Hartwell heiress, and so there was a great deal of preparation, and new clothes finer than any before, and a journey down the river to the city house the family kept for such purposes, and a round of evenings and dinners and dances at which Adelaide was displayed like a piece of the family's plate, handsome and valuable and not entirely real. Esther was not brought out. There was no money to spare on bringing out a girl who would never need to make a brilliant match, and so she stayed at the Reach through that winter, alone in the great house but for the servants and the conservatory and the river under its ice. It should have been the loneliest winter of her life, and in some ways it was, for she missed her sister with a physical ache, the old twin ache of a missing limb. But it was also, she would understand only much later, a kind of rehearsal, a first long taste of the solitary self-sufficient life she would one day have to live in earnest, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could bear it, that she could even, in the long, quiet evenings by the conservatory stove with a book and the green smell and the music in her hands, be something not so far from content. She wrote her sister long letters that winter, and her sister wrote back shorter ones, tired ones, between the dinners, and a new thing began in those letters, a thing that would outlast everything else between them, which was the habit of telling each other the truth on paper that they could no longer quite manage to tell face to face. Adelaide's letters from the city were dutiful and a little desperate. She wrote of the evenings as a soldier writes of a campaign, the endurance of them, the watching eyes, the men who were brought to be introduced and whom she understood even then to be candidates of a kind weighed by her grandfather for their usefulness to the fortune rather than for anything in themselves. She did not enjoy it. She was admired, and the admiration meant nothing to her, because she knew it was for the fortune and not for the girl, and she had begun that winter to grasp the cold central fact of her life, which was that she was not a person to the world that courted her, but a doorway, a way into the Hartwell money, and that any love that came to her would have to be sifted all her life for the gold dust of greed in it. Esther read these letters in the warm glass room and ached for her sister, and could not entirely suppress the small, disloyal thought that she herself, whatever else awaited her, would at least never have to wonder why she was loved. No one would ever court Esther Hartwell for her money, because there would be no money. If a man came to her, he would come for herself, plain and unprovided, and there was a strange, clean freedom in that, a freedom Adelaide would never taste, and Esther, turning it over in the lamplight, began to understand for the first time that the line dividing her life from her sister's might not run as simply as the world believed, that there might be things on her side of the line that were worth having, things that could not be bought and so could not be inherited and so had been left, by accident, entirely to her. When Adelaide came home from the city in the spring, the two sat up late in the conservatory among the plants, as they had not done in a long while, and for a few hours the old closeness came back, the doubled motion, the half-spoken sentences, the deep wordless knowing. Adelaide laid her tired grand head on her sister's shoulder among the green smell and said that she hated it, all of it, that she wished sometimes she could trade places, that Esther seemed to her the freer of the two, and Esther held her and did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had thought the very same thing in the other direction, and that perhaps that was the truth of it, that each of them had a life the other quietly longed for, and that there was no way, none at all, to swap. For the staking was nearly done by then, the long gentle training of the two branches apart, and they both knew it. The grandfather was old and would not last many more winters, and when he went, the thing that had been decided in the dark would step out into the light and become real, and Adelaide would take up the fortune and the duty and the cage, and Esther would take up the small unprovided freedom, and there would be no swapping and no sharing and no cutting down the middle, because the very heart of the thing, as they had been told 100 times, was that it could never be divided. They knew this. They had grown up knowing it. And still, that spring, in the warm glass room, with the river running high outside and the first bulbs Pruitt had taught Esther to set just breaking the soil, they let themselves pretend for one evening that it might somehow be otherwise. It was a kind thing to let themselves believe, and a sad one, and it could not survive the daylight, but it warmed the evening, and the evening was worth having. They fell asleep at last in their chairs among the plants. 2 grown girls in a glass room, the stove ticking, the green smell all around them, and a servant found them there in the early light and did not wake them at once, but stood a moment in the doorway looking at the 2 dark heads fallen toward each other, so alike still, after everything, that even now you might not have told the one from the other, were it not for the things that the years had quietly written on each, the weight on the one and the openness on the other, the crown beginning to bow the elder and the freedom beginning to lift the younger, the 11 minutes finally, slowly, coming into their long inheritance. To understand what the old man did, you have to understand the fear that he did it out of, and the fear had a history, the way the deepest fears in a person usually do. Josiah Hartwell had come up in a hard world, and had watched, with the cold attention he gave to everything, the rise and fall of other men's fortunes, and one pattern had impressed itself on him above all others, and never left him. He had seen great houses built in one generation and emptied in the next. He had seen a man amass a thing of real weight, a thing that took a lifetime and a particular ruthlessness to gather, and then watched that thing dissolve the moment the man was in the ground, split among his children and their spouses and their separate notions and their separate debts, until within 20 years there was nothing left but a good name growing thin and a house being quietly sold. This terrified him more than poverty ever had, because poverty he had beaten, and this could not be beaten by any effort of his own. It lay on the far side of his death, where his will could not reach unless he reached very far indeed. He came to think of a divided fortune the way a religious man thinks of a soul lost through carelessness, as a waste so total it was almost a sin, and he resolved, early and absolutely, that whatever he built would not suffer that fate. It would pass whole. It would pass down one line to one pair of hands, and those hands would be taught the same horror of division he felt, and would pass it whole again, and so the thing would go on, undying, a kind of immortality bought with the simple refusal ever to share. He was not, in the ordinary run of things, an unkind man. He gave to the church in his cold way, and kept his promises, and paid what he owed to the penny, and he had loved his son, Edward, with a stiff, baffled love that the boy's gentleness and weak chest had never quite known how to receive. But love, to Josiah, was a thing of the heart, and the fortune was a thing of a different and higher order, a thing more like a law of nature than a possession, and where the two came into conflict the fortune won, because the fortune had to win, because the whole meaning of his life depended on its winning. He would have said, had anyone been brave enough to ask, that he was being cruel to no one, that he was simply obeying a necessity, and the terrible thing is that he would have half believed it. It was in the autumn of the twins' 19th year that he set about making it law. He had a lawyer down from the city, a dry, careful man named Mr. Sewell, who had handled the family's affairs for decades and asked no questions he was not paid to ask, and the two of them shut themselves in the study for the better part of a week, and the household understood, in the way a household always understands such things, that something final was being arranged behind that door. The girls felt it. Adelaide felt it as a tightening, a sense of the future closing its hand. Esther felt it as a kind of held breath, awaiting for a blow she had long known was coming and could neither see nor dodge. The thing that Mr. Sewell drew up over that week was elaborate, far more elaborate than a simple will, because a simple will would not have done what the old man wanted done. A simple gift could be spent, could be split, could be carried off by a husband under the laws of that time, which gave a married woman's property into her husband's keeping as a matter of course. Josiah wanted none of that. He wanted the fortune held so tightly that not even the heir herself could break it open, or give it away, or let a husband at it. He wanted it kept whole by the very document that conveyed it, kept whole down through the generations whether the generations liked it or not. So Mr. Sewell built a structure of trusts, a thing of clauses within clauses that would hold the Hartwell fortune in an unbreakable grip long after the hand that made it was dust. Adelaide was to be the heir, the elder by 11 minutes, and Adelaide was to have the whole of it, the mills and the rail shares and the long roll of lands and the great house itself, but she was to have it the way a keeper has a thing rather than the way an owner has it. She could live on the income handsomely forever. She could not sell the heart of it. She could not divide it. She must pass it whole to a single heir of her own, on the same terms, or, failing an heir of her own body, to whatever Hartwell the trust should name, and so on down the years, the dead man's grip never loosening. It was, when you looked at it clearly, less an inheritance than a sentence of stewardship, a life-term in service to a thing, and the old man thought it the finest gift he had to give. And Esther was to have nothing. This was not an oversight, not a thing the old man failed to think of. It was the deliberate other half of the design, as necessary to it as the giving. For if Esther had been given anything of the fortune, anything at all, the fortune would have been divided, and division was the one unforgivable thing. So the document named her carefully by name, the way such documents must, and set against her name not a sum, but the plain statement that she was to receive nothing of the trust estate, that her sister was to be sole heir, that the testator's whole intention was the keeping whole of what he had made. To be named in order to be excluded is a particular kind of wound, and Esther would carry it quietly a long time. But she did not yet know it had been written. None of them spoke of it yet. The document went into the safe, and the safe was locked, and the household went on. It was Adelaide who learned first, and she learned it from the old man himself, in one of the solemn sessions when he judged her old enough to be told plainly what she was being made for. He sat her down in the cold study with the locked safe behind him, and the slow clock ticking in the hall beyond, and he told her without softness and without apology the shape of her future. She would have everything. Her sister would have nothing. This was not cruelty, he told her. It was preservation. She must understand it, must take the whole weight of it onto herself, must be prepared to keep the fortune whole against every pressure, including, he said, looking at her steadily, the pressure of her own affections, the pull of her love for her sister, which would tempt her all her life to share what could not be shared. She must be stronger than that love. The fortune required it. Adelaide sat very still while he told her, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to him, and went up afterward to her river-facing room and was sick quietly in the basin, and then sat for a long time on the edge of her bed in the failing light. She was 19 years old, and she had just been handed the world and told that the price of it was her sister, and she understood, in that terrible clear hour, that she'd been understanding it for years without letting herself know, that the whole long training of her childhood had been bending her toward this, that the cage had been building around her since before she could remember, and the door had only just now been named. She did not want it. She had never wanted it. But it was hers, and it was coming, and there was no one anywhere who would help her refuse it, least of all the old man, who believed he was being generous. She told Esther that night because she could not tell her, because the one thing she could not do was sit across from her sister at breakfast carrying that secret. They met in the conservatory, late, by the light of a single lamp among the dark plants, and Adelaide said it as gently as a thing like that can be said, that the will was made, that she was to have everything and Esther nothing, that their grandfather had told her she must be strong enough to keep it whole even against her love, and then she broke, and wept, and said that she would not, that she did not care for the fortune, that they would share it whatever the old man's papers said, that she would find a way. And Esther held her, and let her say it, and did not tell her, that night, the thing she already suspected, which was that there would be no way. For Esther had grown up in that house too, and had listened to the same commandments, and understood the structure of the thing better than her grieving sister did in that first shock. She understood that the old man had not simply expressed a wish. He had built a machine, a thing of clauses and trustees designed precisely so that Adelaide's love could not undo it, so that no softness in the air could reach the fortune to break a piece off for a sister. The whole genius of it, the whole cold brilliance, was that it did not depend on Adelaide's will at all. Adelaide could weep, could promise, could mean every word. It would change nothing. The fortune would pass whole, because the dead hand had made it impossible for it to pass any other way. Esther saw this clearly, even at 19, and the seeing of it was the moment her childhood truly ended. So she did a generous thing that night, the first of the many quiet generosities that would shape the rest of her life. She did not let her sister carry the guilt. She held Adelaide in the lamplight among the plants, and told her that it was not her doing, that she must never think it her doing, that the old man had arranged it all, and that no choice of Adelaide's had made it so, and no choice of Adelaide's could now unmake it. She told her sister that she did not blame her, and would never blame her, and she found, saying it, that it was true, that she did not blame her, that the thing was too large and too old and too far above either of them to be laid at the feet of a girl who had wanted it no more than she had. The grandfather had done this, not Adelaide. Esther held to that distinction with both hands, and it saved them both. It would have been so easy, and so natural for the thing to poison everything between them, for Esther to look at her sister, who was to have the world and feel the slow acid of it eating at her love. Many a pair of sisters has been broken on far less, and there were moments, in the years that followed, when Esther felt the acid stir in her and had to master it, had to remind herself again of the distinction she had drawn that night, that it was the old man's doing and not her sister's, that Adelaide was as much a prisoner of the will as she was an heir to it. But she did master it mostly, most of the time, and the mastering was perhaps the hardest and finest work of her life, and it left her in the end freer than her sister, because the one who forgives is always freer than the one who must be forgiven. The grandfather did not live to see how it would all fall out, which was perhaps a mercy for him, though he would not have thought so. He would have wanted to see his machine run. He took a chill that winter, the winter after he told Adelaide, and it went to his chest the way such things went in that family, and within a fortnight he was gone, dying as he had lived, alone in his cold rooms with his locked safe and his certainties, attended only by servants and a doctor he did not trust. He died believing he had done a great thing, had defeated by sheer cold resolve the dissolution that swallowed other men's fortunes, had reached past his own death to keep his life's work whole. He died not knowing that the thing he'd kept whole would prove, in the long counting of years, to be worth so much less than the thing he had broken, which was the simple, equal bond between two sisters, and that even that he had not, in the end, quite managed to break. They buried him beside his son and his daughter-in-law in the family plot, under a stone larger than any of theirs, and the valley came out to see him put down, less from love than from the sense that an age was ending, that a certain kind of man was passing from the earth. The two granddaughters stood at the grave in their black, the heir and the disinherited, side by side as they had stood at every grave of their short, hard-edged lives, and they held hands, the bones aching, as they always did, and what passed between them through that grip no one watching could have read. They were the last of the Hartwells now, just the two of them, one to have everything and one to have nothing, and the old man who had arranged it so was in the ground, and the machine he had built was about to start, and there was no one left anywhere with the power to stop it. The house went into mourning the way it did everything, thoroughly and by the old rules. The mirrors were draped in black so that for weeks the girls could not catch sight of themselves passing in the halls, which gave the rooms a strange unanchored feeling, as if no one quite lived in them. The clocks were stopped at the hour of the death, and the great clock in the hall, whose slow tick had been the pulse of the lower floor for as long as either girl could remember, fell silent, and the silence where its ticking had been was the loudest thing in the house. The knocker was wrapped in crape. The servants moved in black and spoke in the lowered voices of the bereaved, though few of them had loved the old man, for grief and propriety are not the same thing, and a great house knows the forms of one whether or not it feels the other. The two sisters wore the deep black of close mourning, the dull crepe that took no light, and they were measured for it by a seamstress brought in for the purpose, and Esther noticed, standing for her fitting, that even now, even in grief, the old habit held. Adelaide's mourning was of finer stuff than her own, and was cut with a little more care, and no one thought anything of it, because Adelaide was the heir, and the world bends its small attentions always toward the heir, even at a graveside, even in the house of the dead. Esther stood for her fitting in her plainer black, and felt the old familiar lesson settle into her once more, the lesson of which way the snow slides, and she had grown so used to it by now that it scarcely stung. Scarcely. The will was read a week after the burial, in the cold study where it had been made, by Mr. Sewell, who came down again from the city in his own black, and spread the documents on the dead man's desk with the dry ceremony of a man who has done this many times and feels nothing about it. The two sisters sat before him, and a few others were present, an elderly cousin or two who had been remembered with small bequests, the housekeeper, the old lawyer's clerk. The afternoon light came thin and grey through the tall windows, and the stopped clock in the hall said nothing, and Mr. Sewell cleared his throat and began to read, and the future that had been built in secret stepped out at last into the open air. It took a long time, for the document was long, and most of it was the slow unrolling of the structure, the trusts within trusts, the clauses that bound and the clauses that held, the careful machinery of the keeping whole. Esther sat very straight and listened to all of it, and understood most of it, better than anyone in the room but the lawyer, and waited for her own name, and at last it came. She heard herself named, heard the careful legal statement that she, Esther Hartwell, granddaughter of the testator, was to receive nothing of the trust estate, that the whole was to pass to her sister, that this was the deliberate and considered intention of the deceased. She heard it spoken aloud, in the dry voice of the lawyer, in the cold room with the others listening, and she kept her face still and her hands folded, and she did not look at her sister because she knew that if she looked at her sister, she would not be able to keep her face still. There is a particular loneliness in being publicly given nothing, a loneliness sharper than mere want. To be poor among strangers is hard, to be named the nothing child before the housekeeper and the cousins, in the house where you were born, by the voice of the law, while your twin is named the everything child in the same breath, is a thing that goes in deeper and stays longer. Esther felt the eyes of the room touch her and slide away, felt the pity in them, which was worse than scorn, and she sat through it with her chin level and learned, in those few minutes, a strength she would draw on for the rest of her life, the strength of being able to be looked at with pity and not break. It is not a strength anyone would choose to be given, but she was given it, and she took it, because there was nothing else to take. Adelaide did not bear it as well. Adelaide, who had everything settle onto her in that reading, the mills and the lands and the great house and the long heavy stewardship, sat white and rigid through it, and could not afterward have told you a word of the machinery, because all she heard under all the lawyer's clauses was the one fact that her sister was being given nothing while she was being given the world, and the wrongness of it filled her so completely that there was no room left in her for anything else. When the reading was done and Mr. Sewell folded his papers, Adelaide stood, and her voice shook, and she said to the room that she did not accept it, that she would share with her sister whatever the papers said, that no document would keep her from her own twin. And Mr. Sewell looked at her, not unkindly, and said that she would find she could not, that the trust did not permit it, that her grandfather had foreseen exactly this and built against it. The fortune was hers to keep, he said. It was not hers to give. It was the truth, and it was the cruelest truth of the whole cruel design, and it landed on Adelaide in that cold room like a second death. She had told herself, since the night in the conservatory, that whatever the will said she would find a way to share, that love would find a way that she could not be made to take everything from her own sister, against her own will. And now the lawyer, with no malice at all, simply stating a fact, had told her that she could not give what she did not truly own, that she was a keeper and not an owner, that the dead man's grip held her as tightly as it held the fortune. She was not free to be generous. The one thing she most wanted to do with her inheritance, the only thing that would have made it bearable, was the one thing it was specifically built to forbid. There was, it turned out, exactly one thing Esther was to have, and it did not come from the grandfather at all. It came from her mother, Frances, that quiet counterweight, had had a little money of her own, a small settlement from her own family, modest by the standards of the Hartwell fortune but real and entirely hers, the one sum in all the house that the old man's machinery had no claim on. And Frances, before she died, foreseeing more than anyone had given her credit for, had left that small sum to be divided between her daughters, share and share alike, the only equal division in the whole estate. It was not a great deal of money. It would not have kept a Hartwell in gloves, but to Esther, who was to have nothing else, it was the difference between dependence and a chance, between being a poor relation forever and being, however modestly, her own woman. And she understood, when she learned of it, that her mother had reached out of the grave to give her the one thing the old man had tried hardest to deny her, which was a way to leave. For that was the question that hung over the house in the strange weeks after the reading, unspoken but heavy in every room. What was Esther to do now? She could stay, of course. Adelaide begged her to stay and meant it with her whole heart. The great house was Adelaide's now, and there was room in it for 1,000 sisters, and the income would clothe and feed Esther forever, without the fortune itself being touched. Esther could live at the Reach all her life as the heir's twin, a permanent guest in the house of her birth, wanting for nothing material and owning nothing at all, a kind of cherished shadow. Many a disinherited daughter of that age lived exactly so, and called it the best that could be hoped for and was, by the world's reckoning, fortunate. And for a while, in the first grief and disorientation, it seemed that this was what would happen, that the two of them would simply go on together in the great house as they always had, the geometry merely formalized. But Esther, lying awake in the long nights of that morning, with the clock stopped and the mirrors draped and her own future a dark unwritten thing, came slowly to understand that she could not do it, that to stay would be to die in a way that had nothing to do with the body. To stay would be to be the shadow forever, to take her sister's bounty all her life, to be the one who was given to rather than the one who gave, to live always inside the fact of her own nothing. She loved her sister. She would always love her sister. But she could not build her whole life on the floor of her sister's pity, however gently the pity was offered. And she knew, in those long nights, that if she stayed she would slowly come to hate them both, her sister and herself, and that the love would not survive it. So she made up her mind to go, and the making up of it was the bravest thing she ever did, braver than anyone watching could have understood, for the world would have called her a fool to leave a fortune's worth of comfort for a few $100 and an unknown life. She did not tell her sister at once. She let the morning run its course, let the mirrors be uncovered, and the clock set going again. Let the house come back, by slow degrees, to its ordinary life, which was now Adelaide's life, the life of the mistress of Hartwell's Reach. And she watched her sister take up the duties of it, the ledgers and the rents and the cold, solemn obligations the old man had bred her for. And she saw the weight come down on Adelaide in earnest. The real weight, no longer the rehearsal of childhood, but the thing itself, and the seeing of it strengthened her own resolve, because she saw that the fortune was a burden as much as a gift, and that in leaving it she was perhaps not losing as much as the world believed. The household in those weeks sorted itself around the new order, as households do. Some of the old servants left, pensioned or moved on. Some stayed and transferred their long loyalty to the new young mistress. The housekeeper kept her keys and her power, and adjusted smoothly to taking her orders from a girl she'd known in the cradle. Mrs. Dell still ruled the kitchen, and was kind to Esther still, kinder now, for the servants understood exactly what had been done to the younger girl and felt for her in their wordless way, and there were small offerings in those weeks, a particular cake left where Esther would find it, a posy from the conservatory, the rough tendernesses of people who could not change a thing but wanted her to know that they saw. Old Pruitt the gardener, when he understood that she meant to go, gave her a box of slips and seeds wrapped in damp moss, so that wherever she landed, he said, she could start a green thing of her own. She kept that box like a treasure. It was in its way a better inheritance than the fortune. And so, by the time the first hard winter after the grandfather's death set in, the shape of the two lives was finally and fully drawn, no longer a thing the future was tending toward, but a thing the present had arrived at. Adelaide was the mistress of the great house, and the keeper of the undivided fortune, bound to it for life, free to spend its income on anything in the world except the one thing she wanted, which was to share it. and Esther was a young woman with a few $100s of her mother's money, a box of slips and seeds, a trunk of plain clothes, a head full of green knowledge and warm kitchens and music that talked, and no place yet in all the world to put any of it, about to walk out of the only home she'd ever known into a life she would have to make entirely with her own 2 hands. The 11 minutes had finished their work. The line had divided for good. On the last night before she left, the 2 sisters sat up together one final time, not in the conservatory but in Adelaide's river-facing room, the warm good room, the heir's room, with a fire built high against the cold. They did not say much. There was not much that could be said that would not have made the leaving harder. Adelaide pressed money on her sister, again and again, far more than the small legacy, money from her own ample income that the trust did not forbid her to give, and Esther took only a little of it, only enough to be sensible, and refused the rest, gently, firmly, because she understood that to take it would be to begin, on the very first night, the long slide back into being the kept shadow she was leaving in order not to become. Adelaide wept at this, and called her proud, and Esther held her and said that pride was about all she'd been left, and that she meant to keep it, and that her sister of all people should understand the keeping whole of the one thing one had. When her sister had gone, Adelaide stayed, because staying was the whole of what she'd been made for, and she took up the keeping of Hartwell's Reach the way a soldier takes up a post, out of duty and not desire. The house was hers now, every cold room of it, and the mills were hers, and the lands and the long rolls of leases and the income that came in month upon month like the river, steady and indifferent and far more than any one person could ever spend. She was, by the reckoning of the world, among the most fortunate young women in the country, an heiress in the full flower of the great age of heiresses, and she would have traded all of it, that first winter alone, for one more ordinary morning in the conservatory, with the only person who had ever loved her without first weighing the fortune. She learned, in those first months, the true shape of what she had been given, which was not freedom but its opposite. The fortune did not serve her. She served it. There were the agents and the managers who came to her with their books and their decisions, and though they deferred to her with great ceremony, she understood that she was less their mistress than their occasion, that the real master was the thing itself, the fortune, which had its own needs and made its own demands and bent every life around it toward its single purpose, which was to go on being whole. She rose in the morning to its business and went to bed at night having done its business, and the business was endless, and it was not, in any way she could find, hers. She was the keeper. The thing she kept did not love her back. And she was watched, always, in the particular way the very rich are watched, which is a kind of solitude disguised as attention. The valley knew her, and bowed to her, and told stories of her, and none of the knowing reached her at all, because it was the fortune they knew and bowed to and told stories of, with her name attached to it as a label is attached to a jar. When she went among people, she felt their eyes do the thing she had first felt in the city as a girl, the quick sliding calculation, the seeing through her to the money behind, and she had learned to bear it with a smooth, still face, but bearing it did not make it warm. She moved through her own life as through a glass case, visible, valuable, untouched. It was understood that she must marry, for an unmarried heiress was thought an unfinished and slightly alarming thing, and besides there must be an heir of her own body to carry the fortune whole into the next generation, or the dead man's grip would pass it sideways to some cousin, and his design would falter. So the business of finding her a husband was taken up, soberly, as another piece of the fortune's business, and suitors were considered the way investments were considered, weighed for their soundness and their connections and the use they might be to the keeping whole. Adelaide had no real part in the weighing. She was consulted, as she had always been consulted, in the way that allows a person to feel asked without giving them any power to decide, and in the end the choice was made on grounds that had nothing to do with her heart, because her heart had never been a factor anyone thought to consider, least of all herself. The man chosen was named Charles Loring, the son of a banking family from the city, a man of good name and sound fortune of his own, which was thought important. For a husband with money of his own would be less of a danger to the Hartwell money, less likely to be a fortune hunter, more likely to understand the keeping of a great estate because he had been raised to it himself. He was not unkind. It is important to say that, because the easy story would make him a villain, and he was not a villain. He was simply a cold, correct man raised in a cold, correct world, who approached marriage as he approached everything, as an arrangement to be conducted with propriety and competence, and who had no more notion of warming his wife's heart than of warming the river. He married Adelaide with perfect ceremony, and treated her with perfect respect, and never once in all their years together gave her the one thing she had not known she wanted until she found it permanently withheld, which was to be loved as a person and not managed as a holding. The wedding was the grandest the valley had seen in a generation, for the marriage of two such fortunes was an event of consequence, and there were marquees on the lawn, and flowers brought up the river in ice, and a great deal of the city aristocracy come to see, and Adelaide stood through all of it in white, straight-backed and lovely, and entirely alone in the centre of the crowd that had come to celebrate her. Esther was there. Adelaide had insisted on it, and had sent the fare, and Esther had come, plainly dressed among the silks, and the two sisters had had 1 hour together, stolen from the day, in the old conservatory, and that hour had been the only real thing in the whole bright, artificial week, and they had both known it and had clung to it and had let it go. The married life that followed was outwardly all that such a life should be, and inwardly a long, quiet starvation. Charles Loring came to live at the Reach, for the Reach was the heart of the fortune and could not be left, and he took up the management of it with a competence that pleased the agents and freed Adelaide of much of the business, and so she found herself, after marriage, with less to do rather than more, mistress of a great house run by a capable husband she did not love, and who did not love her, with long empty days to fill and nothing in all her wealth that could fill them. She had her music, which she played without joy. She had her correspondence, which meant chiefly her letters to Esther, the one warm channel left in her cold, full life. She had the running of a household that ran itself, and she had the waiting, the long waiting for a child who did not come. For the child did not come, year upon year, and the not coming was its own slow grief, made sharper by the fact that everyone around her regarded it as a failure of her central purpose, a flaw in the machinery, a threat to the keeping whole. There was no cruelty spoken aloud, but there was a coolness that deepened, a sense in the house and in her husband and in the agents that she was not performing the one office for which the whole structure required her, and Adelaide absorbed this the way she had absorbed everything all her life, in silence, turning it inward, adding it to the cold weight she already carried. She wanted a child herself, wanted one with a longing that had nothing to do with the fortune, wanted someone in that great silent house to love without first having to sift the love for greed. The child did not come. In time she stopped expecting it, and the stopping was a small death among the many small deaths of her ample life. She did not become, in those years, the figure the old man's design might have produced, the miser frozen on her pile, the recluse barred and shuttered against a world of imagined thieves. Adelaide had too much of her gentle father in her for that, and too much of the warmth her mother and her sister had kept alive in her in the early years, and she did not curdle the way her grandfather had curdled, the way a person can curdle who has nothing in them but the fortune. But she grew quiet and still, and a little grey before her time, and the great house grew quiet around her, and there was a hush over her life that was not peace, but its imitation, the hush of a thing that has given up expecting to be moved. She kept the house beautifully. She kept the fortune whole. She did her duty, every part of it but the one her body would not perform, and she did it well, and it cost her everything, slowly, the way such costs are always paid, in instalments too small to notice until the whole sum is gone. The one thing that kept her, the one warmth she had, was the letters and the knowledge, underneath everything, that somewhere down the river her sister was alive and well and thinking of her. They wrote to each other faithfully all those years, and Adelaide's letters were the truest thing she produced, for in them she could lay down the smooth, still face she wore in the world, and simply be Adelaide, tired and lonely and missing her twin, and Esther's letters back were like windows opened in a stale room, full of the air of a different kind of life, a smaller, warmer, fuller life, and Adelaide read them again and again, and was glad of her sister's happiness, and was, beneath the gladness, more envious than she could ever have brought herself to say. For the letters told her, slowly over the years, the strange thing that was happening, the thing the old man had never foreseen, which was that the disinherited sister was building a life rich in everything his fortune could not buy. Esther wrote of work, and of friends, and of a man, and then of a husband, and then, in time, of children, and the children's names came down the river to the great childless house and landed in Adelaide's quiet heart with a complicated weight. She was glad. She was truly glad. She loved her sister and rejoiced in her sister's joy. And she was undone by it too, for every warm, crowded letter from Esther's small house was a measure of the cold spaciousness of her own, and she came, reading them, to understand the deepest irony of her grandfather's design, which was that in giving her everything he had taken from her the only things that, in the end, a person cannot do without. There is a kind of poverty that wears fine clothes and lives in a great house, and is never named as poverty because the world cannot see past the clothes and the house to the empty rooms behind the eyes. Adelaide lived that kind of poverty, in the midst of more money than she could count, and the cruelest part of it was that she could not even claim it, could not say to anyone, "I am poor, I am starving," for the words would have been laughed at, would have seemed an obscene complaint from a woman who had everything. She had everything. That was precisely the trouble. She had everything except the things that mattered, and there was no one she could tell, no one in all her gilded world who would have understood except one person, 50 miles down the river, who understood completely, and to whom she could write, and did, faithfully all her life, the truth she could tell to no one else. There were duties that came with the fortune beyond the keeping of it, the duties the age expected of its wealthy women, and Adelaide performed them all, faultlessly and without warmth. She sat on the boards of charities and gave to the building of a library and a wing of a hospital, for it was the fashion of the time that the rich should return some portion of their wealth to the world that had made them, and her name appeared on the subscription list, and was spoken of with respect, and none of it touched her at all. She gave because it was expected, and because the giving was easy, easier by far than the one gift she longed to make and was forbidden, and she came to understand that there is a kind of generosity that costs nothing, and means nothing, the scattering of a little from a great surplus, and that it is not to be confused with the other kind, the kind that gives what it can ill spare to someone it loves, which was the only kind that had ever mattered, and the only kind the trust would not let her practice. Her days had a shape, and the shape was the same from one year to the next, and the sameness was its own slow grief. She rose and was dressed by a maid, and took a breakfast she did not need at a table laid for one, for Charles breakfasted early and apart. She saw the housekeeper, and approved the day's arrangements, which arranged themselves whether she approved them or not. She wrote her letters, the dutiful ones, and the one that mattered. She walked, when the weather allowed, in the formal gardens where old Pruitt's successors kept the beds in the rigid order the place required, nothing growing freely, everything clipped and staked and held. And in the evening she dressed again, more finely, for a dinner she ate in near silence across a long table from a husband with whom she had, by then, almost nothing left to say, the two of them small and far apart in the candlelight, served by men who moved like shadows, in a room built to seat 40. The servants did not know her, and she did not know them, and the not knowing was a loneliness she had not expected, for she remembered from her childhood the warmth that had run, despite everything, between the family and the old servants, Mrs. Dell in her kitchen, and Pruitt in his garden, and Hannah who had raised her. Those people had loved her, in their rough, wordless way. They had been, some of them, nearer to her than her own blood. But they were gone now, dead or pensioned, and the people who served her in her later years were strangers hired for their competence, who did their work well and kept their distance, as was proper, and who saw in their mistress only the cool grey figure of the rich old woman they worked for and never suspected, moving through her cold rooms, that she would have given a great deal to be spoken to just once, the way Mrs. Dell had spoken to her sister in the warm kitchen long ago, plainly, as one person to another with nothing weighed. The years went by in the great house the way years go by when nothing changes, smoothly and emptily and faster than seems possible. The mills ran, the rents came in, the fortune kept itself whole. Charles Loring grew older and more correct and more remote, until he was less a husband than a kind of resident administrator, civil and distant, and Adelaide grew older too, and quieter, and the grey came fully into her hair, and the great house held them both in its cold, formal arms, and asked nothing of them but that they keep it, which they did. From the road, on a winter evening, with the lamps lit in the tall windows and the snow coming down over the gardens and the river, Hartwell's Reach must have looked like the very picture of everything a person could want, The people who passed it and looked up at those golden windows and sighed with longing could not have known. No one outside ever can. Esther left Hartwell's Reach on a grey morning in early winter, in a hired carriage, with one trunk and a carpet bag, and the box of slips and seeds wrapped in damp moss on her knees. She had said her goodbyes the night before, the long firelit goodbye with her sister, and she had said them again that morning to the servants who had loved her. Mrs. Dell red-eyed in the kitchen doorway, old Pruitt standing bareheaded in the cold by the gate, the housekeeper unbending enough to press her hand. She did not look back at the house as the carriage went down the drive. She had decided not to look back, had decided it the night before, because she knew that if she looked back she would see the tall grey windows and the gables against the winter sky and feel the pull of all that safety, and she did not trust herself yet to feel that pull and keep going. She went first to the city, because the city was where a young woman with a little money and no place might most easily find both work and lodging, and because the anonymity of it suited her need to begin again unknown. The city of those years was a great roaring contradiction, a place of more wealth and more want crowded closer together than anywhere on earth, where a man might step from a marble bank into a street of children with no shoes, and Esther, coming into it from the slow green quiet of the valley, found it overwhelming at first, the noise of it, the smell of coal smoke and horses and massed humanity, the sheer relentless press of so many lives. But she found, too, almost at once, a thing she had never had in all her years at the Reach, which was the freedom of being no one in particular, of walking down a street and being looked at by no one, weighed by no one, expected by no one to be anything at all. She took a room in a respectable boarding house in a street of such houses, a tall, narrow building kept by a widow named Mrs. Pratt, who let rooms to single women of the genteel sort, governesses and music teachers and shop assistants, and the daughters of families that had come down in the world. It was a clean plain room high under the roof, with a sloped ceiling and a small grate, and a window that looked out over a forest of chimney pots, and it cost a careful portion of Esther's small means each week, and it was, she found to her own surprise, the first space in all her life that was entirely and only hers. No one else had a claim on it. No housekeeper inspected it. No grandfather's machinery reached into it. She unpacked her trunk and set her mother's small clock on the mantel, and put the box of slips in the window to catch what light the chimney pots allowed. And she stood in the middle of the little room and understood that she was, for the first time, home in a way she had never been home in the house of her birth. She had to earn, of course, for the small legacy would not last forever, and she had no intention of letting it run out while she sat idle, and so she set about the business of finding work, which was no simple thing for a woman of her background in that age. She had been raised a lady, and a lady's hands were supposed to be idle, and the few kinds of work open to a genteel woman who must support herself were narrow and ill-paid, and shadowed always by the faint disgrace of having to work at all. She could be a governess, teaching other people's children in other people's houses. She could be a companion, fetching and reading aloud for some querulous old woman. She could sew if her eyes and fingers held out, for the long hours and small pay of the needle trades. Or she could do the one thing she truly loved and was truly good at, which was music, and it was to music that she turned. She let it be known, through Mrs. Pratt and through the small careful networks by which such things travelled, that she gave lessons on the piano, and slowly, a pupil at a time, the work came. The first was the daughter of a shopkeeper a few streets over, a stolid, unmusical child whose parents wished her to be accomplished, and Esther taught her with patience and got her through her scales, and the shopkeeper paid promptly and recommended her to a neighbour, and the neighbour to another, and within a year Esther had pupils enough to fill her days and pay her rent and put a little by. The lessons were given in the pupils' homes mostly, for she had no instrument of her own at first, and she walked from house to house through the city streets in all weathers with her music under her arm, and she came to know the city as you can only know a city you walk, street by street, block by block, in every season and every light. It was hard, and there were lean times, and there were days when the old life at the Reach rose up in her memory with a treacherous sweetness, the warm fires always laid, the fine food always set, the never once having to think about the cost of a thing. There were evenings when she came home wet and tired to the cold little room with its small grudging grate, and counted her week's small earnings, and felt the thinness of her new freedom against the thick comfort she had left, and wondered in the low hours whether she had been a fool. But she had only to imagine the alternative, only to picture herself back at the Reach as the kept shadow, taking her sister's bounty all her life, owning nothing, being nothing of her own, and the wondering would pass and she would bank the little fire and go to her own bed in her own room and sleep, the sound sleep of a person who is poor but free, which is a better sleep, she came to believe, than most rich people ever know. She was poor in the particular way that the genteel are poor, which is a poverty with manners, a poverty that keeps up appearances because appearances are the last of its capital. She turned her collars and cuffs when they wore, so that the worn side went under, and the room they faced saw only the good. She dyed a faded dress black and got another year out of it. She learned the small economies that the truly poor know in their bones, and that she had to learn from scratch, the cheaper cuts and the day-old bread and the careful husbanding of coal, and she learned them without shame, for she had decided early that there was no shame in being poor that one had not earned, only in pretending otherwise. She kept herself neat and clean and upright, and held her head level, the way she had learned to hold it in the cold study under the lawyer's pitying eyes, and the holding of it served her well, for the world treats the genteel poor a little better when they refuse to be pitied. And she made friends, which was the great unlooked-for richness of those years, for the boarding-house was full of women in her own situation, and the situation made a kind of sisterhood. There was a governess named Miss Finch who had come down from a county family and bore her reduction with a dry wit that made Esther laugh as she had not laughed in years. There was a milliner, a sharp, kind, clever woman named Ruth, who could trim a hat out of nothing, and who taught Esther a great deal about the world that her sheltered upbringing had left out. There was an old retired actress on the floor below who had a fund of stories and a fund of cheap sherry and a generous heart, and the women of that house gathered in one another's rooms in the evenings, sharing what little they had, the heel of a cake, the dregs of the coal, the long warm talk that cost nothing, and Esther, who had grown up among more wealth than any of them could imagine, found among them a fellowship she had never known, and would not have traded back for the whole of the Hartwell fortune. She set her slips, too, in the window of the little room and in pots begged from the kitchen, and the green things grew as green things will if they are loved, and her window high among the chimney pots became, by her second spring in the city, a small hanging garden, a geranium in flower, a fern uncurling, a slip of something Pruitt had given her grown leggy and reaching for the smoky light. The other women of the house came up to see it, and to take cuttings, and Esther taught them, as Pruitt had taught her, how to coax a new plant from a slip, and so the green knowledge spread through that house of poor genteel women, and there were window-sills all up and down the building by and by, with something growing in them, and the building was the brighter for it, and no one who passed in the street and glanced up at all those green windows would have guessed how little money lived behind them. She wrote to her sister, faithfully, all through these years, and in the writing she found that she could tell Adelaide things she could not have told her face to face, the truth of her hard days, and the truth of her small joys both, and the letters that came back from the great house were a window the other way, a window into a life that had everything Esther's lacked, and lacked everything Esther's had. She read between her sister's careful lines, the cold spaciousness of that life, the loneliness in the very evenness of it, the starvation that wore fine clothes, and she grieved for Adelaide, truly grieved, even in the lean times, even when her own week's earnings would not have bought a yard of the silk her sister wore without thinking, for she understood, more clearly with each year, the thing the world could not see, which was that of the two of them she had been given, by the accident of those 11 minutes and the cruelty of the old man's design, by far the better portion, and that her sister, the heir, the fortunate one, was the one who had truly been left with nothing. It was in the third year of her new life that she met Daniel Rees, and the meeting was as ordinary as everything else in that life had become, and as quietly momentous. He was a printer and bookbinder who kept a small shop a few streets from the boarding-house, a steady brown-eyed man some years her senior, with ink permanently in the creases of his hands and the smell of paper and binding glue about him, that she came, in time, to love better than any perfume the Reach had ever held. She had gone into his shop to have some sheets of music copied and bound for her pupils, and he had done the work well and charged fairly and talked to her, as they settled the account, of books and of music and of the small affairs of the street. Talked to her as a person, and not as anything else, for he had no idea who she was, and there was nothing about her plain neat figure to suggest she had ever been anyone, and she walked home from his shop that first day, feeling lighter than she had felt in a long while without quite knowing why. The city taught her things the Reach never could, and most of them it taught through her feet, for she walked everywhere in all weathers, to her lessons and her errands, and a city walked is a city learned. She came to know which streets caught the morning sun, and which stayed cold till noon, which corners the wind found and which were sheltered, where the good cheap bread was to be had at the end of the day, and where the flour seller stood with her buckets. She learned the city's smells, which changed street by street and season by season, coal smoke and horse and river and baking and the green wet smell of the parks after rain. And she learned its sounds, the bells and the cries, and the endless rumble of the carts, until the great roaring place that had overwhelmed her at first became, by slow degrees, simply home, a thing she knew in her body, a thing that no longer frightened her at all. The evenings in the boarding house were the warmth of those years, the gathering of the genteel poor women in one another's rooms when the day's work was done, and Esther came to treasure them as she had once treasured the rare, warm evenings of her childhood. They shared what little they had, and the sharing made it more, a pot of weak tea, the heel of a cake, a length of ribbon to make over a tired hat, the long warm talk that costs nothing and is worth everything. Miss Finch told dry, funny stories of the grand family she had governessed for, and Ruth the milliner mended everyone's bonnets and everyone's spirits with her sharp, kind tongue, and the old actress on the floor below recited, when the sherry was in her, whole speeches from plays no one staged anymore, her cracked voice filling the small room with the ghost of old applause. They were poor, all of them, and getting older, and the world had largely forgotten them, and they made among themselves, out of almost nothing, a fellowship richer than most of the grand drawing-rooms Esther had been raised to. There was a freedom in being no one that Esther came to prize above almost everything, the freedom her sister would never know. No one watched her. No one calculated, seeing her, the worth of what stood behind her, because nothing stood behind her, because she was only what she appeared to be, a plain neat woman with music under her arm and ink-free hands. She could walk down a street and be looked at by no one, could buy her bread and pay her rent and live her days entirely outside the great weighing machine of consequence that had pressed on her since the cradle, and the lightness of it, after a childhood spent always being measured and always coming up the lesser, was a thing she felt in her very step, a thing that some mornings, walking to her lessons in the early light with her breath clouding the cold air, came close to joy. She went back, of course, for more music to be bound, more than her few pupils strictly needed, and he was always glad to see her, and the gladness was plainly for her, and not for any fortune behind her, for there was no fortune behind her, and Esther understood, with a clean joy that her sister would never know, that here at last was a thing the old man's machinery could never have produced for Adelaide, no matter how it tried, a man who wanted her, Esther, the plain music teacher with ink-free fingers and a window full of geraniums, and wanted nothing else, because there was nothing else to want. She was loved for herself or not at all. It had been the one freedom the disinheritance gave her, the freedom from being courted for her money, and now, in the small ink-smelling shop, that freedom was bearing the sweetest fruit a life can bear, and she reached for it with both hands, the way her sister all those years ago had reached for the crown, but with a far better hope of holding what she caught. They were married quietly, Esther and Daniel, on a bright cold morning, in a small church with only a handful of people in the pews, the women from the boarding house, a few of Daniel's friends from the trade, no family on either side to speak of, for Daniel's people were gone, and Esther's were either dead or 50 miles up the river in a great house that did not come to such weddings. Adelaide sent her blessing and a gift of money that Esther this time did not refuse entirely, for it was a wedding gift and not a charity, and there is a difference, and Esther had learned to tell it. They came out of the church into the thin winter sun as man and wife, and walked back through the city streets to the rooms above the printing shop that were to be their home, and Esther carried, in her plain gloved hand, a single hothouse flower that one of the boarding-house women had spent more than she could afford to give her, and it was the only extravagance of the whole day, and Esther kept it pressed in a book for the rest of her life. The rooms above the shop were small, and Esther, who had been born in a house of 40 rooms, found in their smallness a happiness she could never quite explain to anyone who had not lived both ways. There was a parlour that was also a dining room, that was also, by lamplight in the evenings, a place where Daniel did the close accounts of the shop while Esther mended or read, and there was a kitchen no bigger than a pantry at the reach, and there were the 2 bedrooms above, and that was all. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a kingdom. The whole of it could have been set down inside the great cold drawing room of her childhood, with space to spare, and it held more warmth than that whole great house had ever managed, because it was full, always, of the one thing the Reach had always lacked, which was life lived close and unguarded and unafraid. The shop below was the ground of their life together, and Esther came to love it as she had loved the conservatory long ago, for it was a place of making, a place where raw things became finished, things under patient hands. She learned its workings the way she had once learned the gardens, the smell of the inks and the oils, the heavy clean smell of new paper, the particular sweetish smell of the binding glue that meant Daniel was at the press of his trade he loved best, the binding up of loose pages into a thing that would last. She helped him when the work was heavy, folding and gathering and stitching, for her fingers were quick and patient from the long apprenticeship of the needle, and she found in the work a deep plain satisfaction, the satisfaction of useful labour done well beside a person you love, which is a satisfaction no amount of money can buy and no amount of money can fake. The children came in their time, 3 of them across the early years of the marriage, and with them the small rooms grew smaller and fuller and warmer still. There was a boy first, and then a girl, and then another girl, and Esther, who had grown up so carefully apportioned, so measured against a sister, raised her own 3 with a fierce determination that they should never feel the cold arithmetic she had felt, that no child of hers should ever stand a little apart and learn the lesson of which way the snow slides. She had no fortune to divide among them, and so there was nothing to divide them over, and she came to see this, the very poverty that the world pitied, as a kind of gift to her children, for they grew up with nothing to inherit but each other and the example of their parents, and so they grew up, all 3, knit close, with none of the watchfulness that wealth breeds. The home was loud by the standards of the Reach, which had prized above all things a certain hush. There was the noise of the children, and the noise of the shop coming up through the floor, and the noise of the street coming in at the windows, the cries of the hawkers and the rattle of the carts and the bells of the churches marking the quarters, and Esther, who had been raised in a silence so deep you could hear a clock 3 rooms away, found that she had come to need the noise, to be made uneasy by its absence, for the noise was the sound of life going on all around her, close and ordinary and real. In the evenings, when the shop was shut and the children were abed, a different quiet came, a small warm domestic quiet, the lamp lit, the fire low, Daniel at his accounts, and Esther at her mending, and that quiet was the sweetest thing she knew, and she would look up from her work sometimes and around the small full room and be unable to believe her own good fortune, she who'd been left by the law and her grandfather with nothing at all. Money was always short and always would be, and Esther never pretended otherwise to herself or to the children. There were years when the shop did poorly and they went very carefully indeed, and there were the long, anxious passages that any small tradesman's family knows, the waiting on a bill to be paid, the juggling of what was owed against what was owing, the lying awake doing sums in the dark. The great panics that swept the country in those decades, the years when banks failed and work dried up and men walked the streets looking for any labour at all, touched the Reeses as they touched everyone of small means, and there were thin winters, and the children's boots were mended and mended again, and Esther turned her collars to the very last thread. But they never went under, and they never went hungry, and they never, in all the lean years, lost the thing that the lean years could not touch, which was the warmth of the small full rooms and the closeness of the people in them. She kept her music through it all, for music was bread to her in more ways than the literal, and there was always an instrument in the home, a battered upright that Daniel had taken in trade and reconditioned for her, its tone a little soft, a few of its keys a little slow, and Esther played it in the evenings and taught her children on it, and taught her pupils on it when she still took pupils, and the sound of it came up through the floor of the shop and out the windows into the street, and the neighbours came to know it. The music from the Reeses' rooms, and some of them said it was the pleasantest thing in the street of an evening. She played for the joy of it, as she always had, the playing that talked, and her children grew up inside that music the way she had grown up inside the sound of the looms, hearing it without hearing it, carrying it in them all their lives. Daniel was a good man, plainly and steadily good, in a way that her grandfather with all his iron had never managed to be, and her sister's husband with all his correctness had never managed to be either. He was not clever in the way the world admires, and he had no ambition beyond the keeping of his shop and the keeping of his family, and there were those who would have called him a small man, a man of no consequence, and they would have been measuring with the wrong rule. For he loved his wife without reservation and without calculation, loved her for herself, the plain music teacher he had married, and never once in all their years gave her cause to sift his love for any greed, because there was no greed in it, because there was nothing in her to be greedy for but herself, and that, it turned out, was exactly and only what he wanted. Esther had married the one thing her sister's fortune could never buy, and she knew it, and she was grateful for it every day of her life. She did not forget the reach, or her sister, or the strange shape of the thing that had been done to them both. She thought of Adelaide often, 50 miles up the river in the great cold house, and she wrote to her faithfully, and she read the careful, lonely letters that came back, and she grieved, in the midst of her own crowded happiness, for the spacious emptiness of her sister's life. She told her children about their aunt, in time, told them they had an aunt who lived in a great house up the river, an aunt who was very rich and rather sad and whom they had never met, and the children, who had grown up with nothing and counted themselves rich in each other, found it hard to understand how a person could be both rich and sad, and Esther found, trying to explain it to them, that she could explain it perfectly, that she had understood it her whole life, that it was the central fact of her family and the lesson of her own good fortune. For she had come, by the middle of her life, to a settled understanding of what had happened to her and her sister, an understanding without bitterness, which is the hardest kind to reach. She did not pretend the disinheritance had not been a wound. It had been a wound, a deep one, and she carried the scar of it always, the particular scar of having been named in order to be excluded, of having stood in the cold study and been told before witnesses that she was to have nothing. But she'd come to see that the wound had been, in the strange economy of a life, the making of her, that the very thing that cast her out of the great house had cast her into a real life, that the nothing she was given had turned out to contain everything, while the everything her sister was given had turned out to contain a kind of nothing, and that there was a justice in this, of a slow and secret sort, that the old man with all his cold calculation had never reckoned on. She wondered sometimes in the evenings, with the lamp low and Daniel at his accounts and the children breathing in the rooms above, whether she would change it if she could, whether she would go back and undo the 11 minutes and the red wool and the old man's design, and take her half of the fortune and live the comfortable measured life that half a fortune would have bought. And she found, turning it over honestly, that she would not, that she could not wish away the thing that had given her all of this, the small full rooms and the good plain man and the 3 close children and the music that came up through the floor, and that if the price of all of it had been the loss of a fortune she had never really had, then it was the cheapest thing she had ever bought, and the dearest, and she would pay it again, gladly, every time. The Sundays were the best of the small full days, for on Sundays the shop was shut and Daniel was wholly theirs, and the family kept a slow, gentle rhythm that asked nothing of anyone. There was a long, lazy breakfast and a walk if the weather was fine, the whole tribe of them down to the park or along the river that ran through the city as it ran through everything in that country, and there was a plain good dinner in the middle of the day, the smell of it filling the small room since morning, and there was the long, easy afternoon after, the children at their games on the floor, Daniel with his pipe and his paper, Esther at the piano playing whatever came to her, the light moving slowly across the room as the day declined. They were ordinary days, the kind no one writes down, the kind that leave no mark on any history, and they were, Esther knew even as she lived them, the very substance of a happy life, the gold that cannot be counted because it is spent in the spending and gone, and worth more than any fortune kept whole in a vault. The shop below was always there beneath their life, the steady ground of it, and the children grew up in the smell of it, the ink and the oil and the clean, heavy smell of paper, and they learned, without being taught, the patience of making, watching their father turn a heap of loose-printed sheets into a bound book that would outlast them all. Daniel let them help when they were old enough, gave them small, safe tasks, the folding and the gathering, and there was a pride in the children at being trusted with the work. A pride that the heirs to great fortunes who are given everything and trusted with nothing never know. Esther watched her children at their father's bench, their tongues between their teeth in concentration, ink on their small fingers, and thought of her sister's great house where no child had ever come, and held her own the closer, and was grateful, and said nothing, for there was nothing that needed saying. She raised them, all three, with the one fierce determination born of her own childhood, that there should be no arithmetic among them, no measuring of one against another, no sense in any of them of being the lesser or the greater. She had no fortune to favour one with, and she counted that privately a mercy, for there was nothing to divide them over, nothing to set the cold sum running in their hearts, the sum she had felt run in her own, when she stood a little apart in the nursery and learned which way the snow slides. Her children would inherit nothing but each other and the example of their parents, and Esther meant them to inherit that whole and undivided, and she watched them grow up close, the three of them, knit together with none of the watchfulness that wealth breeds, and she thought it the best thing she had made, better than any music, the simple, unweighed love among her children, the thing her grandfather's whole fortune had never once managed to buy. Outside, the city roared on, the great age of fortunes and want, the marble banks and the shoeless children, the few rising like weather and the many labouring in their shadow, and somewhere up the river a great house kept itself whole and cold around a lonely woman, and somewhere in a quiet plot the old man slept under his oversized stone, his design running on exactly as he had built it, the fortune undivided, the keeping kept, and in a small warm set of rooms above a printing shop, a woman who had been given nothing sat in the lamplight among the people she loved, mending by the low fire, the music of the street coming in at the window, and was, by any measure that counts in the end, the richest of them all, and the last to know it and the gladdest when at last she knew. Between the great house and the small rooms ran a thread, thin and faithful, and the thread was made of letters. For all the years of their separation, through all the changes of both their lives, the two sisters wrote to each other, and the letters went up and down the river by the mails the way the loom's rain sound had once gone out across the valley. Steady, patient, almost without thought, simply a thing that was always happening underneath everything else. Neither of them ever proposed that they should write or made any vow about it. They simply began the night Esther left and went on, and the going on became the deepest constancy of both their lives, the one unbroken line in two lives that had been broken apart by design. The letters were the place where the sisters were still twins. In the world they had become almost opposites, the rich woman and the poor one, the keeper of the great house and the wife above the shop, two figures so far apart in circumstance that a stranger seeing them side by side would never have guessed they had begun as a single creature in one cradle. But on paper the circumstances fell away, and what was left was the old closeness, the doubled knowing, the half-spoken understanding that needed no completing, and a woman reading her sister's letter by a window, whether the window looked over a river or over a forest of chimney-pots, was for that hour simply one half of a pair, restored to her other half across the miles, made whole again in the only way that remained to them. There was a great unfairness in the letters, and both of them knew it and neither of them ever named it, which was that Esther had so much more to tell. Her life was crowded with event, with the children and their growing, with the small dramas of the shop and the street, with births and illnesses and recoveries, and the thousand turnings of a full domestic life, and her letters ran long and bright and full, and Adelaide read them again and again, hungrily, the way a person snowed up alone reads of the warm countries. And Adelaide's letters back were shorter and quieter and had less in them, not because she felt less, but because so little happened to her, because the great even tide of her wealthy life threw up so few things worth the telling, and she would sit at her fine writing desk in the great cold house and find that a whole month had passed, and that she had nothing to set down but the weather, and her health and her love. But the love was always there, in both directions, and it was the love that the letters truly carried, underneath the news or the want of news. Esther's letters carried it in their fullness, in the way she told her sister everything, kept nothing back, let Adelaide into the small warm rooms as fully as paper allowed, so that Adelaide, reading, could almost smell the binding glue and hear the music coming up through the floor and feel the press of the close, happy, crowded life. And Adelaide's carried it in their very thinness, in the way that the few quiet lines were so plainly the most she could manage, and were sent anyway, faithfully, month upon month, a hand reaching out across the miles from the centre of all that cold spaciousness toward the one warmth left to it. Esther learned to read the love in the thinness, learned that a short letter from her sister was not a small thing but a large one, the offering of a person who had little to give but gave it without fail. She kept them, all of them, her sister's letters, in a box that Daniel made for her, a plain good box of his own binding, and the box filled over the years, and on certain evenings Esther would take it down and read back through it, through the whole long correspondence, and watch the two lives unroll side by side in the ink. There was the early letter in which Adelaide first wrote that she was to be married, the careful, brave letter that had tried to make the best of it. There was the letter, years later, in which she wrote, in 3 short sentences and a long silence of white paper after them, that there would be no child. There were the letters that marked the deaths of the old servants, Mrs. Dell, and then Pruitt, the gardener who had given Esther her box of slips, and Esther had wept over that one, alone, by her window of green growing things that had all come, everyone, from that old man's gift. And there were Esther's own letters, which she did not have, of course, for they were up the river in the great house, but which she knew her sister kept as faithfully as she kept Adelaide's, for Adelaide had told her so, had written that she read them over in the long evenings, that they were the brightest thing in her year, that she sometimes thought she lived more in Esther's letters than in her own days. It was a sad thing to read, that a woman with everything should live more in the letters of a woman with nothing than in her own ample life, and Esther read it and understood it completely and grieved over it, and wrote back longer letters still, fuller, brighter, as if she could send enough of her own warm, crowded life up the river in ink to thaw a little of the cold in which her sister lived. They did not see each other often, in the body, across those years, for the 50 miles between them might as well have been 500, given the gulf of their circumstances and the slow difficulty of travel and the demands of both their lives, the shop that could not be left and the great house that could not be left either. There were visits, a handful across the decades, and they were strange and precious, and not quite enough. For the 2 women who met in the body were the rich one and the poor one, hedged about with all the awkwardness of that, the fine carriage at the door of the shabby street, the plain woman in the grand cold rooms, and it was only when they got past the circumstances, got down at last to the 2 of them alone, that the old closeness could come back, and there was never quite time enough for the getting past before one or the other had to go. The letters did it better. On paper there were no carriages and no shabby streets and no cold rooms, only the 2 voices twined as they had been from the start. It was through the letters that each lived the other's life, at one remove, across the years. Esther knew the great house better, in some ways, than she had known it when she lived in it, for Adelaide wrote of its silences and its seasons, of the rooms still kept that were never entered, of the slow round of its empty grandeur, and Esther, reading by her own warm fire, could see it all. The tall grey windows and the cold halls, and the lonely woman moving through them, and the seeing made her hold her own small, full life the closer. And Adelaide knew the small rooms above the shop as if she had lived there, knew the children's names and natures, knew the shop and the street and the music, knew it all from the bright full letters, and she would sit in the great house and close her eyes and be, for a moment, in the small one, and the small one was the place she would rather have been, every time, though she never quite let herself write that and never needed to, for Esther knew. There came a thread of worry into Adelaide's letters, in the later years, a thing she touched on lightly and then drew back from, which was the state of the fortune itself. The great even tide of the Hartwell money, which had seemed in the grandfather's day a force as fixed as the river, had begun, under the strains of the age, the panics and the failures and the slow shifting of the country's wealth into new hands and new kinds of enterprise, to show that it was not, after all, beyond the reach of time. The mills were old, the trade had changed. Charles Loring managed the holdings with all his cold competence, but even cold competence could not make the old machinery young again, or the old lands yield what they once had, and Adelaide wrote in a careful sidelong way of retrenchments, of holdings sold, of the fortune no longer growing as it had grown but holding, and then not quite holding, beginning very slowly to ebb. She wrote of it without alarm, for she had income enough still for any need she could imagine, and the great house ran on, and the fine clothes were still made. The ebbing was a thing of the books and the agents, not yet a thing of daily life. But there was a strange note under her writing of it, a note Esther caught at once, which was something almost like relief, as if the slow loosening of the dead man's grip, the first failing of the thing he had built to be undying, were not entirely unwelcome to the woman who had been chained to it. Adelaide did not say this. Adelaide perhaps did not let herself think it. But Esther read it under the lines, the faint unconfessed relief of a prisoner who feels, after long years, the first give in the bars, and she understood her sister, as she always had, better than her sister understood herself. And so the two lives ran on, side by side and far apart, joined by the thin faithful thread of the letters, the one life filling and the other slowly emptying, the one growing rich in the things that cannot be counted, and the other growing, by slow degrees, less rich in the only thing it had ever had. The years stacked up. The children in the small rooms grew toward their own lives. The great house up the river grew quieter and a little shabbier at its unseen edges as the fortune ebbed. And the letters went up and down the river through all of it, faithful as the seasons, carrying their freight of news and want of news, and underneath, always, the one thing that did not change, and would not change, and had survived everything the old man's design had thrown at it, which was the love between two sisters who had begun as one, and who, whatever the law and the lawyer and the locked safe had decreed, had never truly been divided at all. There was a ritual to the letters, on both ends of the thread, and the ritual was part of what they carried. Esther wrote hers at the kitchen table when the children were abed, and the house was quiet by the light of the lamp, with the noises of the street coming faint through the shutters, and she wrote them slowly in her clear plain hand, and she did not cross her words to save the paper as the very poor did, for a letter to her sister was the one small luxury she allowed herself without stint. And up the river Adelaide wrote hers at a fine inlaid desk with every costly thing to hand, the good paper, the silver standish, the stick of sealing wax in the family colour, and the two letters, the plain and the fine, would meet somewhere on the river road between them, passing in the mails, each carrying its freight of love toward the other, and neither sister ever knew, sealing hers, that the other was perhaps at that very hour sealing its answer. The greatest of all the letters, the one Esther kept folded inside another for safekeeping, was the one she had written when her first child was born, and the one her sister had written back. Esther had written to tell Adelaide that she was an aunt, that there was a boy, well and strong, and she had felt, writing it, the old complicated ache, the joy of it shadowed by the knowing that her sister, married into the great house for the very purpose of bearing an heir, had no child and might never have one, and Adelaide had written back a letter that Esther could not read, even years later, without her eyes filling, a letter full of a joy so pure and so unguarded that it could only have come from a woman who had set her own grief entirely aside to rejoice in her sister's, and at the end of it Adelaide had written that she would think of the boy as half her own, since she had none, and that she was glad past saying, that there was a child in the family at last, even if it was not to be hers, even if it was to grow up in 3 small rooms and not in 40 cold ones. It was in the letters, more than anywhere, that the deepest truth of the two sisters lived, the truth they could show each other and no one else. In the world, Adelaide wore her smooth, still face, and Esther wore her level chin, and each kept up, before the people around her, the part she had been given, the great lady and the poor genteel widow-to-be, and neither could afford in the daylight world to be entirely herself. But on paper, in the privacy of the thread that ran between them, they laid the parts down. Adelaide could be lonely on paper, could say the things the great house would never have let her say aloud. Esther could be tired on paper, could admit the lean weeks and the worn boots she would have dyed before showing to a soul. They told each other the truth, the whole of it, all their lives, and the telling was a kind of home that no house could give either of them, a place built of ink and trust and 50 years of faithfulness, where each could go whenever she needed and be wholly known. On a winter evening in the small rooms, Esther would finish a letter to her sister, and seal it and set it ready for the morning's post, and then she would sit a while by the fire with the box of Adelaide's letters open on her knee, reading back through the years of them, the whole long faithful correspondence, and the lamp would burn low and the music would have stopped, and the children would be sleeping, and Daniel would be at his accounts, and Esther would hold the letters and think of her sister 50 miles up the river in the great cold house, alone, growing old, and she would feel across all that distance the old twin closeness, the doubled knowing, undimmed, and she would think, not for the first time, that there must surely come a day before the end, when the two of them would find their way back to each other, not on paper, but in the body, and sit at last in one room again, side by side, the way they had begun. She did not know yet how that day would come, but she had begun to believe those evenings by the fire that it would. Charles Loring died in the autumn of a year when the leaves came down early, of a trouble of the heart that had been gathering in him unremarked, for he was a man who remarked on nothing about himself, and he went as he had lived, correctly and without fuss, leaving his affairs in perfect order, and his wife in a grief that was real but strange, the grief of a woman who has lost a person she never quite had. Adelaide mourned him properly, with all the forms, and felt, under the forms, a confusion she was ashamed of, for she could not honestly find in herself the great sorrow that a widow was supposed to feel, only a quieter and lonelier thing, the loss of a presence, the removal of the one other person who had moved through the great house with her, however coldly, so that now there was no one moving through it at all but herself and the servants and the long silences. For that was what his death left her with. More than sorrow, it left her alone, fully and finally alone in the great house with the fortune. The children that might have filled it had never come. The husband who had at least shared its rooms was gone. Her grandfather was long dead, her parents longer, the old servants of her childhood mostly dead too or pensioned away, and the new ones were strangers who served her well and did not know her at all. She was past middle age now, grey and straight and quiet, the mistress of Hartwell's Reach, the keeper of the undivided fortune, and she moved through the 40 cold rooms of her inheritance entirely alone, and the thing the old man had built to be a triumph had become, in the slow working of the years, exactly what he had most feared and laboured against, a great hollow shell with the life gone out of it, kept whole and kept empty, kept perfectly for no one. And the fortune itself, the precious thing, the thing for whose sake everything had been done, was failing. Not collapsing, not vanishing, nothing so dramatic, simply ebbing slowly and steadily, the way a tide ebbs, the way the old man's strength had ebbed in his last winter. The age that had made the Hartwell money was passing, and a new age was coming on with new kinds of wealth and new kinds of men, and the old mills with their rain-sound looms could not compete with the great new factories, and the old lands did not yield as they had, and the careful holdings that Charles had managed so coldly and well were worth, year by year, a little less. The trust held the fortune whole, exactly as designed, but it could not hold it from shrinking, for that was a thing no claws could reach, and the dead man's grip, so strong against division, was helpless against mere time, which divides everything in the end, whether we will it or not. Adelaide watched it ebb with that strange unconfessed relief she'd first felt years before, the relief of the prisoner who feels the bars beginning at last to give. She did not want to be poor, she had no romantic notions about want, having watched her sister's hard, genteel struggle from a safe distance for many years, and understood it for the grind it was. But she found, as the fortune shrank, that the shrinking lifted something off her, that each holding sold, each retrenchment, each loosening of the dead hand's grip, made her feel a little more like a person and a little less like a keeper, and she began to understand that the fortune had been, all along, less a possession of hers than a possessor of her, and that as it released its hold she was, by slow degrees, being given back to herself, the self that had been emptied out in the cold study long ago and filled with the wants of the house. She wrote of all this to Esther, in her quiet, sidelong way, and Esther read it and understood it fully, and wrote back the long warm letters that were the great comfort of Adelaide's emptying years. And it was in this passage of their lives, the autumn of them, that the long, slow turning of their two fates became at last undeniable, visible even to them, who had lived inside it and so had felt it only gradually. For look how it stood now, after all the years. The sister who had been given everything sat alone in a cold, shrinking house, with no child and no husband and no friend within 50 miles, kept company only by servants who did not know her and by the letters of the one person who did. And the sister who had been given nothing sat in a small warm home, grown a little quieter now as the children launched into their own lives, but full still of love and music and use, surrounded by people who knew her to the bone, rich in every coin that cannot be counted. The world, had it troubled to look, would still have called Adelaide the fortunate one, for the world counts only what can be counted, and Adelaide, even ebbing, even alone, had more money than her sister would see in 10 lifetimes. But the sisters knew the truth of it, both of them, and had known it for a long time, and the knowing was not a triumph for Esther nor a defeat for Adelaide. It was simply a fact they had arrived at together, the fact at the bottom of their whole shared story, which was that the old man, in his cold cleverness, had got it exactly backward. He had given everything to the child he meant to favour, and nothing to the child he meant to deny, and in doing so he had handed the cage to the favoured one and the open sky to the denied, and the 11 minutes that he had used to choose between them had chosen, it turned out, against the very one he chose. Esther never gloated over this, not for an instant, not even in the privacy of her own heart, for she had done the hard work, decades before, of refusing the acid of envy, and the refusing had freed her from the wish to win. She did not want to have beaten her sister. She wanted her sister to be happy, had always wanted it, grieved that she was not, and the slow revelation that her own despised portion had been the better one gave her no pleasure at all where it touched her sister's loneliness, only a deeper tenderness, a deeper wish to gather Adelaide in. If anything, the turning made Esther love her sister more, and more achingly, for it showed her with terrible clearness what Adelaide had been made to suffer all these years for the crime of having been born 11 minutes too soon, and Esther, who had been thought the wronged one, came to feel that her sister was the one truly wronged, robbed by her own inheritance of every ordinary good thing. There came a letter, in this season, that Esther kept apart from all the others, in a place by itself because it was the one in which her sister came nearest to saying the whole of it plainly. Adelaide wrote, in the careful hand grown a little shaky now with age, that she had been thinking in the long evenings of the night they were born, the night the midwife had tied the red wool, and that she'd come to think that the red wool had been tied around the wrong wrist, or rather around the right wrist for the wrong reason, that it had marked her not as the one who would be given everything, but as the one who would be made to carry everything, and that she would have given the whole of what she carried, gladly, every penny and every acre and every cold, beautiful room, for the small, warm life her sister had built out of nothing. She did not write it as a complaint. She wrote it as a thing understood, late and accepted and almost at peace with, but Esther read it and wept, alone, by her window, for the long waste of her sister's gilded years. And it was that letter, more than any other, that set the last movement of their lives in motion, for in reading it Esther understood that the time had come, that the day she had begun to believe in by the fire years ago was near at hand, the day when the two of them would find their way back to each other not on paper but in the body, and sit in one room again, side by side, the way they had begun. She did not yet see how it would be arranged, the practical shape of it, the great house and the fortune and the 50 miles and all the weight of the separate lives they had built. But she knew, with the deep wordless certainty that had always run between the two of them, that it was coming, that it must come, that whatever the old man had divided was going to be, in the only way that now remained, made whole again before the end. She wrote back to her sister a letter she chose her words in very carefully, for she did not want to frighten her or press her, only to open a door and let her see that it stood open. She wrote that the children were grown and launched now, that the small rooms had room in them again, that there was a chair by her fire that no one sat in of an evening, and that her sister was welcome to it, always, whenever she wished, for as long as she wished, for the whole of the rest of their lives if she wished. She wrote it plainly and warmly and without any of the awkwardness of charity, for it was not charity, it was the opposite of charity. It was a sister asking her twin to come home, and then she sealed the letter and set it for the morning post, and sat a long while by the fire looking at the empty chair beside her own, and let herself imagine for the first time without checking the thought, her sister sitting in it. The closing of the mills was the thing that marked the ebb most plainly, for it could be heard, or rather it could no longer be heard, and the not hearing was the loudest change of all. The great looms that had made the rain sound across the valley since before Adelaide was born fell silent at last, one mill and then another, the machinery stopped, and the hands let go, and the long low buildings of dark stone standing empty by the falling water, and the valley, which had grown up with that sound the way a child by the sea grows up with the sea, woke one season to a quiet it had not known in a lifetime, and found the quiet strange and sorrowful, the sound of an age ending. Adelaide heard the silence from the great house, the silence where the looms had been, and she knew it for what it was, the slow letting go of the thing her grandfather had built his whole cold life around, and she found, listening to it, that she did not grieve. She let the holdings go in those years, one after another, signing the papers the agents brought her with a steadiness that surprised them, for they had expected the last of the Hartwells to cling to the wreck of the fortune the way the old man would have clung. But Adelaide did not cling. Each thing sold was a stone lifted, and she signed the lands away and the shares away, and watched the great undivided thing come apart at last, not by the dividing the old man had so feared, but by the simple ebbing of time, and she felt with each signature a little lighter, a little freer, a little more like a person, and a little less like a keeper, until there was almost nothing left to keep, and she was almost, after a whole life of bondage, free. The agents thought her wonderfully calm. They did not understand that they were watching a prisoner sign away her own chains, one link at a time, and find each parting a relief. Her evenings in those last years at the Reach narrowed to a single room, the one she kept warm, where she sat with the fire and her sister's letters and the long quiet, and she lived more and more in the past and in the thread that joined her to the small house down the river. She would take down the box of Esther's letters and read back through the years of them, the whole bright, crowded record of the life she had not lived, and it was company, of a kind, the only company she had, and there were nights when she sat so long over them that the fire burned out and she did not notice the cold come into the room until she rose at last, stiff and old, to go up to the great empty bed. She was the last of the Hartwells in the house of the Hartwells, and the house was cold and the fortune was nearly gone, and the only warmth in any of it came up off a box of letters from the sister her grandfather had cast out, and Adelaide understood the whole irony of that, sitting by her failing fire, and was too tired at last to do anything with the understanding but accept it. Up the river in the great cold house, Adelaide received the letter, and read it again, and sat with it in her lap in the dim grand room where she now spent most of her evenings, the one room of the 40 she kept warm, and she looked around her at the cold beautiful spaciousness of her whole life, the carved chimney-piece and the good carpet walked around rather than on, and the tall windows holding the last grey light, and she thought of a small warm room above a printing shop, a room she'd never seen with her own eyes but knew by heart from 1,000 letters, and an empty chair by a low fire kept for her, and she understood that she had been offered, at the very end of her long imprisonment, the one thing the fortune had never once been able to give her in all its abundance, which was a place where she would be wanted for herself. She did not answer at once. It was a large thing to decide, after a whole life of having things decided for her, but she kept the letter where she could see it, and she began, slowly in the long evenings, to let herself imagine going. Esther's life, in its later passages, was touched by loss as every long life is, and she met her losses with the same level chin she had carried out of the cold study all those years before, the strength of being able to be struck and not break. The children grew, as children do, and one by one they went out into their own lives, the boy to a trade of his own in another city, the elder girl married to a good steady man, the younger gone for a teacher, and the small rooms above the shop, which had been so full for so long, grew quiet by degrees, the way a tide goes out, until there were evenings when it was only Esther and Daniel again, the two of them by the lamp, as they had been at the beginning, older now, greyer, easier, the long middle of their marriage behind them, and the long companionship of its end settling gently in. Those were good years, the quiet years after the children, perhaps the best of all, for the striving was mostly done, and the worst of the lean times was past, and there was time, at last, simply to sit together of an evening and be glad of one another. Daniel's hands were stiffer now, and the close work of the binding came harder, and he took less of it, and they lived smaller and more carefully than ever, but they wanted little, and what they wanted they mostly had, and Esther would look up from her mending sometimes at the grey steady man across the lamp, the man who had loved her for herself when she had nothing, and feel a gratitude so large and so quiet that it had no words, only the looking. She had married the one thing the fortune could never buy, and it had lasted, and the lasting was the proof of it, and she knew, watching him by the lamp, that she had been, in the only way that counts, a wealthy woman all her life. He died in his sleep one winter night with no fuss and no warning, simply did not wake, and Esther woke beside him to the great changed stillness, and knew before she turned to him what the stillness meant. She grieved him deeply, with none of the strange confusion her sister had felt at her own widowing, for there was nothing confused in Esther's grief. She had loved her husband wholly, and she mourned him wholly, and the mourning was clean and terrible and right. But even in the depth of it she knew herself to be a fortunate woman, for she had had what so few are given, a long full marriage to a person she truly loved, and the grief itself was a kind of wealth, the measure of what she had had, and she would not have traded the grief away if it had meant trading away the love that was its cause. She buried him plainly, and wept, and was held up through it by her grown children come home, and by the friends of a lifetime, and she did not break. It was after Daniel's death that she left the city at last, for the rooms above the shop were his rooms as much as hers, full of him in every corner, and the shop below was sold to a younger man, and there was no longer anything to hold her to the great roaring place where she had made her life. Her elder daughter had settled in a small town up the river, a quiet place of a few streets running down to the water, not far, as it happened, from the country where Esther had been born, though on the humbler side of it, and the daughter pressed her mother to come and be near, and Esther, after a life in the city's press, found that she longed for the river, and the quiet, and the green, longed for them the way she had longed as a girl in the city for the conservatory she had left behind, so she went. The house she took was small, the smallest she had ever lived in, a low cottage at the edge of the river town with a few rooms and a patch of ground and a view, through the back window, of the water going by. The same wide, slow river that ran under the great house 50 miles up its course, so that Esther, settling into her last home, found herself once more within sight and sound of the Hudson that had cradled her whole strange story. She made the little house her own, with the small sure touches of a lifetime, her mother's clock on the mantel, the box of her sister's letters in its place, the battered upright piano carted up from the city, and, in the patch of ground out back and in every windowsill, green things, the descendants, many of them, by long generations of slips and cuttings, of the very plants old Pruitt had given her in a box of damp moss on the morning she left the Reach. She was alone there, in one sense, a widow in a small house at the end of her life, and the world might have pitied her for it, the lonely old woman by the river. But she was not lonely, or not often, for the river town was a friendly place, and she made friends in it as she had always made friends, and her daughter was near, and the grandchildren came, and that was the great late sweetness of her life. The grandchildren, who tumbled into the small house, and filled it with the old loud warmth and learned their notes at the battered piano, and took cuttings from the windowsill plants to grow on their own sills, so that the green inheritance spread on into another generation. Esther in her last years was a grandmother of the best kind, unhurried, attentive, full of stories and patience and lap, and the children loved her without reserve, and she them, and there was no arithmetic anywhere in it, no measuring, no red wool, only the free full love she had spent her whole life learning to give and to take. And in the evenings, when the grandchildren had gone home and the small house was quiet, Esther would sit by her fire with the river going by unseen in the dark beyond the back window, and she would think of her sister. She thought of her more now, in the quiet of her widowhood, for she had time to think, and because the losses of her own late years had taught her freshly what loneliness was, and she knew that her sister had lived inside that loneliness not for a season of widowhood but for the whole of her long life, in the midst of more comfort than Esther could imagine, and the thought of it ached in her worse than ever. She had a spare chair by her fire now, a good comfortable chair, and no one to sit in it of an evening, and she would look at it across the hearth and think of Adelaide alone up the river in the cold grand rooms, and the two empty places, the chair here and the woman there, seemed to her to be calling out to each other across the 50 miles. So she had written the letter, the careful warm letter, telling her sister that the children were grown and the chair was empty and the door stood open, that Adelaide was welcome to come, for a visit or for a season, or for the whole of the rest of their lives, and that there was nothing of charity in the asking, only a sister asking her twin to come home. And having written it and sent it, she waited, and the waiting was a strange, sweet, anxious thing, like the waiting of a girl, and she found herself in the evenings glancing at the empty chair and imagining it filled, setting out, almost without meaning to, a second cup at the evening tea, laying the fire a little higher against the chill so that the room would be warm enough for two. She did not know whether her sister would come. It was a great thing she was asking, she understood that. She was asking a woman past 70 to leave the only home she had ever known, the great house of her whole life, and the wreck of the fortune that was the work of her whole life, and come down the river to a low cottage in a humble town and sit by a stranger's fire. Except that it would not be a stranger's fire, it would be her sister's, the one person on earth who knew her to the bone. Esther turned it over in the long evenings and could not tell which way her sister would decide, for Adelaide had spent her whole life having her decisions made for her, and might, at the very end, find the muscle of deciding too long unused to move. But Esther hoped. She hoped harder than she had let herself hope for anything in many years, and the hoping kept her company, along with the empty chair through the waiting weeks. She kept the small house ready, all that while, the way you keep a house ready for a guest you're not sure is coming, the spare room aired and made up with the good linen, the second chair drawn a little closer to the fire, the cupboard stocked with the small things she remembered her sister liking from their girlhood, a particular tea, a particular kind of plain biscuit, the homely treasures of a shared childhood half a century gone. She told her daughter that her aunt might be coming to live, and her daughter, who had heard the strange family story all her life, and never quite believed that the rich, sad aunt up the river was real, helped her mother ready the house, and the grandchildren were told that their great-aunt might come, the one from the great house, and they were full of questions Esther could not always answer, about why the two sisters had lived so far apart for so long, about what had divided them, and Esther told them, as much as they could hold, the story of the 11 minutes and the red wool and the old man's design, and the children listened wide-eyed and could not understand it, and Esther told them that she had never entirely understood it either, only lived it, and that the living of it had taught her the one thing she most wanted them to know, which was that the things worth having are the things that cannot be inherited, the things you have to make for yourself out of whatever you are given, even if what you're given is nothing at all. The river town took her in gently, the way such places take in a quiet widow who keeps her own counsel and troubles no one, and Esther made it her home with the same small sure touches she had brought to every place she had ever lived. She learned its few streets and its handful of shops, learned which neighbours were kind and which were merely curious, learned the bell of its one church and the rhythm of its market day, and she found, after the long roar of the city, a deep peace in the slowness of it, the way the days went by unhurried, marked by the light on the water and the turning of the seasons rather than by any press of business. She had her daughter near, and that was the anchor of it, and she had the river at her back window, the same river that had cradled her whole strange story, and she would sit of an afternoon and watch it go by and feel herself to be, at the end of a long life of being moved from place to place by forces she had not chosen, exactly where she wished to be at last. The grandchildren were the great late joy, and the small house filled with them as the city rooms had once filled with their parents, the old loud warmth come round again in a new generation. They came on the long afternoons and tumbled through the little rooms and learned their notes at the battered upright and were given, each of them, a slip from the crowded window-sill to grow on at home, and Esther watched them go with their cuttings wrapped in damp paper, and thought of old Pruitt and his box of moss, and felt the long green line running on through her hands into theirs. She told them stories, all the old stories, and answered their endless questions with the patience of a woman who has nothing left to hurry toward, and she loved them without measure and without arithmetic, the way she had loved their parents, the way no one in the great house up the river had ever been allowed to love or be loved, freely, fully, with nothing weighed. And in the deep quiet of her widowed evenings, when the children had gone home and the house was still, Esther would sit by her fire and feel, more keenly than ever, the absence of the one person who had shared the small rooms with her for so long, and the feeling taught her, freshly and from the inside, what loneliness truly was. She had been lonely as a girl, set a little apart in the great house. She had been busy and surrounded for most of her grown life. But only now, in widowhood, did she know the particular ache of the empty evening, the meal cooked for one, the silence where another's breathing should be. And knowing it, she thought of her sister, who had lived inside that ache not for a season but for the whole of a long life, in the midst of more comfort than the small house could imagine. And the thought of it moved her as it never had before, and she resolved, sitting by her fire, that she would not let her sister bear it to the end alone. The river ran by beyond the back window day and night, the same river carrying the same grey water down past the great house and the small one alike, indifferent to fortunes, indifferent to wills, older than the Hartwell name and bound to outlast it, and Esther in her small warm house at the river's edge waited for her sister to come home to her, and the autumn deepened toward winter, and the first cold came down off the water, and still no answer came from up the river, and Esther laid the fire a little higher each evening, and set out the second cup, and kept the chair drawn close, and waited, and hoped, and did not break. Adelaide kept her sister's letter where she could see it, propped on the writing desk in the one warm room, and through the autumn she lived alongside it, the open door of it, the offered chair, and she let herself, by slow degrees, do the thing she had almost never in her life been permitted to do, which was to imagine choosing for herself. It did not come easily. A muscle long unused does not move at the first asking, and the muscle of choosing, in Adelaide, had been still since girlhood, since the cold study and the grandfather's commandments, and the marriage arranged like a transaction, and the whole long-managed life in which every large thing had been decided for her by the fortune and its servants. She sat with the letter and tried to want, simply to want, and found the wanting hard to locate, buried as it was under 50 years of having her wants made small. But it was there, the wanting, when she dug for it, and what it wanted was plain, and had been plain for longer than she had let herself know. It wanted to go to her sister. It wanted the small warm room and the low fire and the chair drawn close, and the one person on earth who would want her for herself. Against this small, clear want stood the whole great weight of her life, the house, the name, the wreck of the fortune, the expectations of a world that would think her mad to leave a mansion for a cottage, the simple inertia of a person grown old in one place. The want was small and the weight was enormous, and yet, as she sat with it through the lengthening evenings, she found the want did not shrink under the weight as her wants had always shrunk before. It held. It was perhaps the first thing she had truly wanted for herself in half a century, and it held, and the holding of it astonished her, and woke something in her that she had thought long dead. The fortune, meanwhile, had come to its quiet end, or near enough to its end that the difference no longer mattered. The long ebb had run its course, the mills were closed, the great looms silent at last, their rain sound gone from the valley forever. The lands were mostly sold. What remained of the Hartwell money was a modest competence, enough to keep one old woman in comfort to the end of her days, but no longer a fortune, no longer the great undivided thing the old man had built his whole life and his whole cruelty around. The trust, that intricate machine of clauses, had held the fortune whole to the very last, exactly as designed, faithful past all reason. It had simply held it whole while time wore it down to almost nothing, like a hand clenched so hard around a fistful of sand that it cannot be opened, holding tight while the sand runs out between the fingers, grain by grain. There was a bitter justice in it that Adelaide was too tired and too near peace to taste as bitterness. The old man had given everything to one granddaughter and nothing to the other, in order to keep his fortune from being divided and so destroyed. And the fortune had been destroyed anyway, not by division but by time, the one divider no clause could bar. And the sister who had been given nothing had built out of her nothing a thing that time could not wear down, a life rich in the uncountable coin, a thing whole and warm and passed on, while the sister who had been given everything sat at the end of it all alone among the wreck of a fortune that had cost them both so much and saved nothing. The old man had won his battle against division and lost everything the battle was for. Adelaide, sitting with her sister's letter, understood this completely, and felt mostly only a great weariness, and under the weariness growing, the small clear stubborn want to go home to Esther. She decided in the end on an ordinary morning, with no drama, the way the largest decisions are often finally made. She woke in the great cold house, in the great cold bed she had slept in alone for years, and lay listening to the silence where, far off, the looms had used to sound, and she thought of the small warm house by the river and the chair kept for her, and she found that she had decided, that it was done, that she was going. She rang for the servant and asked for her writing things and sat up in the bed and wrote to her sister the shortest and truest letter of her whole long, faithful correspondence, which said, in a hand grown shaky, but a meaning grown at last quite firm, that she was coming, that she would come before the winter closed the roads, that she had only to see to the house, and would then come down the river to the chair by the fire and stay, if she might, for the whole of the rest of their lives. The seeing to of the house was the hard part. The long, sad business of closing a life, for a house of 40 rooms lived in by one old woman, is full nonetheless of the accumulation of generations, and it all had to be dealt with, sold or given or let go. Adelaide moved through the rooms in those last weeks, the cold, beautiful rooms she had kept so faithfully and so emptily, and she found that she felt little at parting from most of it. The grand furniture, the good carpets walked around rather than on, the tall cold halls. They had never been hers in any way that mattered, only things she had been set to guard, and she let them go almost gladly, the guard at last relieved of her post. The house itself was to be sold, the great grey pile above the river, Hartwell's Reach, the monument the old man had built to match his fortune. It would pass out of the family that had made it, and Adelaide found she could not grieve for that either, for the family it had been built to glorify had dwindled to 2 old women, and neither of them wanted it, and a house that no one wants is only a weight of stone. There were a few things she kept, small things, the things that turn out to matter when the great things are let go. She kept her mother's miniature, the small painted likeness of the quiet woman who had bought in 2s and divided in halves and reached out of her own grave to give Esther the means to leave. She kept the box of Esther's letters, the whole long correspondence of 50 years, which she had read and reread in the lonely evenings and which had kept her, more than she had ever quite admitted, alive, and she kept from the conservatory, which had stood half derelict for years, its stove long cold, its glass clouded, a single hardy plant that had survived against all odds in the ruined warmth, a descendant, though she did not know it, of the very stock old Pruitt had tended when she and Esther were girls, and she had it potted carefully to take down the river, a green thing to carry to her sister, though she could not have said quite why it seemed so important to bring it. On the morning she left Hartwell's Reach for the last time, it was winter, and the snow was coming down over the gardens and the river the way it had come down on the night she and her sister were born, slow and serious and laying itself over all the shapes of the world. Adelaide came down the great staircase she had climbed and descended 10,000 times, past the floor after silent floor, and through the cold hall where the tall clock still kept its slow, patient time, the clock that had been the pulse of her whole childhood, and she did not have it stopped, for there was no death in the house this time, only a leaving, and she wanted it to go on ticking for whoever came next. She went out the great door into the falling snow, and got into the hired carriage with her few kept things and the potted plant on her knee, and she did not look back at the house, for she had decided, like her sister half a century before her, that she would not look back, that the looking back was the thing that held you, and she did not want now at the very last to be held. The carriage went down the long drive between the snow-laden hedges, and out the gate where old Pruitt had once stood bareheaded to see her sister off, and turned south along the river road, toward the small town 50 miles down the water, where a low cottage waited with a fire laid high, and a chair drawn close and a second cup set out, and Adelaide sat back in the cold carriage with the green plant on her knee, and watched the great house slide out of sight behind the falling snow, and felt rising in her, under the weariness and the strangeness and the fear of so large a change so late, a thing she had not felt in so long that she scarcely knew it at first for what it was. It was lightness. It was the lightness of a burden at last set down, the lightness of the keeper at last relieved, the lightness of a woman of 70 going, for the first time in her life, towards something she had chosen because she wanted it, and only because she wanted it, with no fortune weighing in the scale. The river ran beside the road all the long cold way, the wide grey water that had cradled the whole story, and Adelaide watched it go by and thought of her sister somewhere ahead down its course, waiting, and thought of the 2 of them as girls standing at the cold nursery window looking out at the snow, so alike that even their mother could not always tell them apart, before the 11 minutes had done their work, before the house had begun its long, patient leaning, when they were still simply 2 halves of one whole with their hands found in the dark. She thought she would like to find her sister's hand again before the end. She thought that might be, after everything, after the whole long divided life, the only inheritance she'd ever truly wanted, and the only one no will could give or take, and the one that had been waiting for her all along. 50 miles down a river she had only, at the very last, found the courage to follow home. The closing of a great house is a long and melancholy labour, and Adelaide moved through it slowly that autumn, room by cold room, deciding the fate of the accumulation of generations. There were the great pieces of furniture, dark and heavy and good, that had stood in their places longer than she had been alive, and the agents found buyers for most of them, and Adelaide watched them carried out the great door and felt nothing, for they had never been hers in any way that mattered. There were the carpets walked around rather than on, and the silver that came out only for the dinners that had long ceased to be given, and the linen pressed and stacked in presses by hands now dead, enough linen for a household of 50, and all of it had to be dealt with, sold or given to the church or simply let go, and Adelaide dealt with it steadily, a little astonished at how light she felt as the rooms emptied, as the great grey house gave up, piece by piece, the weight it had carried for so long. There were rooms she had not entered in years, the shut cold rooms of her childhood, and she went into them now in the closing, and they smelled of dust and disuse, and the particular chill of long unheated stone, and the light came grey through the shutters onto furniture under sheets, and she stood in them and remembered. Here was the old nursery, where she and Esther had slept head to head in one cradle, and found each other's hands in the dark. Here was the schoolroom where Miss Ames had taught them their letters before the lessons divided. Here was the cold study where the old man had told her what she was to be and what her sister was not to be, and where the lawyer had read the will aloud while Esther sat with her chin level and her face still. Adelaide stood in the empty study a long while, where it had all been decided, and found that she could not even be angry any more, only sorry, for the frightened old man and for the two girls and for all the long waste of the years between. And there were the small things she chose to keep, and the choosing of them told her, more plainly than anything, what her long life had taught her about worth. She did not keep the silver or the good furniture, or any of the costly things the world would have called the treasures of the house. She kept her mother's miniature and the box of her sister's letters, and a few small homely objects with no value but memory, and the one green plant from the ruined conservatory, and these few things went into a single small trunk, and when she had packed them she stood and looked at the small trunk, all that she would carry out of 40 rooms and a whole great fortune, and she thought how strange it was, and how right that a life should come down at the last to so little, and that the so little should be, every piece of it, a thing that money could not have bought. And down the river, in the small house at the edge of the town, Esther had the letter that said her sister was coming, and she had read it a dozen times, and she had the fire laid high, and the chair drawn close, and the spare room aired, and the second cup set out, and she sat by the window through the short snowy afternoon watching the road that came into the town from the north, the road along the river, the road her sister must come by, and she waited as she had waited the whole of her life with such patience, but with her heart now up in her throat for the first sight of a carriage coming slow through the falling snow, bringing home, after 50 years, the other half of herself. The carriage came into the town in the last grey light of the snowy afternoon, slow along the river road, and Esther saw it from her window before it stopped, knew it the moment it came into view, knew with the old twin certainty that her sister was inside it, and she was up and at the door before the driver had drawn the horses in, out into the falling snow without her shawl, an old woman hurrying down her own short path with her heart in her throat. The carriage stopped at her gate. The door opened, and there, being helped down by the driver, slow and stiff and grey and old, with a green plant clutched against her in one arm, was Adelaide, her sister, the other half of her, come home at last after 50 years, and the two old women stood a moment in the falling snow and simply looked at each other, the way they had looked at each other in the firelit room the night they were born, before either of them had a name. They were old now, both of them, past 70, their dark hair long gone to white, their faces written over with the separate weathers of their separate lives, the one marked by the cold, spacious years, and the other by the warm, crowded ones, and yet, standing face to face in the snow, they were alike still, unmistakably, the same shape of head, the same fold of ear, the same something in the eyes that no number of years could wear away, and anyone passing in the white street and seeing the two of them would have known at a glance that here were sisters, here were twins, here were two who had begun as one. They did not fall on each other's necks. They were too old and too moved for that. They simply reached out both at once and found each other's hands, the way they had found them in the dark of the shared cradle, and held on, and the held hands said everything, all of it, the whole 50 years, all that the letters had carried and all they had not been able to. Esther brought her sister in out of the snow into the small warm house, into the firelit room with the two chairs drawn close, and helped her off with her wet things, and sat her in the good chair by the fire, the chair that had stood empty so many evenings. And Adelaide sat down in it slowly and looked around the small room, the low fire, the mother's clock on the mantel, the battered piano, the windowsills crowded with green, and her eyes filled. For she knew it all, every corner of it, from 50 years of letters, and yet to see it with her own eyes, to be in it at last, in the body, in the warmth, was a thing the letters had never been able to give her. And she sat in the kept chair in her sister's house and wept, quietly, with relief, the way a person weeps who has come, after a very long journey, to the place she should have been all along. Esther made the tea in the second cup that had been set out so many hopeful evenings, and they sat by the fire as the early dark came down and the snow went on falling past the window. 2 old women in 2 old chairs drawn close, and they talked, and the talk was easy, easier than it had ever been in the few strained visits of their middle years, for the circumstances that had always stood between them, the grandeur and the poverty, the great house and the small one, had fallen away at last, worn down to nothing by time, and what was left was only the 2 of them, 2 old sisters by a fire, with nothing between them any more but the long-shared story and the love that had carried it. They talked of the old days, the nursery and the conservatory and the cold study, of their mother who had bought in 2s, of the night they were born and the red wool the midwife had tied. They talked of everything and nothing, in the half-spoken way that had always been theirs, finishing each other's thoughts, falling into the old doubled knowing as if the 50 years had been a single afternoon. And Adelaide in the firelight said the thing she had carried 50 miles down the river to say, the thing she had been trying to say in her letters for years and had never quite managed, which was that she was sorry, that she had taken everything and left her sister nothing, that she had lived in the great house all those years on the wealth that should have been shared. And Esther stopped her, gently, with a hand on her sister's hand, and told her again, as she had told her in the conservatory half a century before, that it was not her doing, that it had never been her doing, that the old man had arranged it all and that no choice of Adelaide's had made it so, and that Esther had never once, in all the years, blamed her, and did not blame her now. The fortune had been the old man's cruelty, Esther said, and it had fallen on them both, on Adelaide as heavily as on herself, more heavily, and they had both been its victims, and there was nothing to forgive between them. Nothing. There never had been. And Adelaide heard it this time, truly heard it, and the last of the weight she had carried 50 years lifted off her in the warm, firelit room, and she was, at last, set down. She had brought the plant, the green thing from the ruined conservatory, and she gave it to her sister, not knowing its history, only knowing that it had seemed important to bring. And Esther took it and looked at it and began, softly, to laugh and to cry at once, for she knew it, knew the leaf and the habit of it, knew it for what it was, a descendant of the very stock old Pruitt had tended when they were girls, the same green line that Esther had carried away in a box of damp moss 50 years before and grown on every windowsill of her life, come down to her now by the other branch, by the sister who had stayed, the 2 green lines reunited on one sill at the last, just as the 2 sisters were reunited by one fire. She set it among the others in the window where it belonged, and the 2 old women looked at the crowded green sill in the firelight, the long inheritance of slips and cuttings, the one inheritance that had been shared all along, and they understood the small miracle of it without needing to say a word. So Adelaide stayed, as Esther had asked, not for a visit or a season, but for the whole of the rest of their lives, which turned out to be a handful of years, a brief sweet coda to the long-divided story, and they were, those last years, the happiest of Adelaide's whole long life, and not the least happy of Esther's either. The small house had room enough for 2 old women who had begun in one cradle. They were used, both of them, to making themselves small, and they fitted easily into the little rooms, and the daughter was near, and the grandchildren came, and Adelaide, who had never had children of her own, who had sat childless in the great house all those years, found herself at the end surrounded by Esther's grandchildren, who took to the gentle grey great-aunt at once and climbed into her lap and learned that being rich and being sad need not go together after all. For here was their great-aunt, who had been the richest woman they had ever heard of, and was not sad now, not any more, not by the fire in the small house with her sister's hand in reach. They settled into a rhythm, the 2 of them, the slow, sweet rhythm of 2 old people who love each other and have learned, at last, to want nothing more than what they have. In the mornings they took their time, for there was no longer anywhere either of them had to be. In the afternoons, if the weather was kind, they walked a little by the river, slowly, arm in arm, two white-haired women by the grey water, and the people of the town grew used to the sight of them and were fond of it. And in the evenings they sat by the fire in the two chairs drawn close, and Esther played sometimes on the battered piano, the playing that talked, and Adelaide listened, who had played all her life without joy, and now found joy at last in simply listening. And the music filled the small warm room and went out a little way into the snowy street, and was, the neighbours said, the pleasantest thing to pass a window of a winter evening. Esther taught her sister, in those last years, some of the things the great house had never let Adelaide learn. The small homely arts of an ordinary life, how to make a thing with her hands, how to coax a slip into a plant, how to be easy among people who wanted nothing from her, and Adelaide learned them slowly, wonderingly, the way a person learns a language late, and took a deep plain pleasure in them that her whole gilded life had never given her. She had spent 70 years being a position, and now at the very end in the small house by the river she was allowed at last simply to be a person, Adelaide, an old woman with her hands in the dirt of a window box and her sister beside her, and she was grateful for it with a gratitude almost too large to bear. And she said to Esther one evening by the fire that she had been given everything once, the whole world, and that it had been nothing, and that now she had nothing, a borrowed chair in a borrowed house, and that it was everything, and that she only wished it had not taken them both an entire lifetime to find their way to so simple a truth. And Esther took her sister's hand by the fire and told her that it had not taken a lifetime, not really, that they had known it all along, the two of them, in the deep wordless place where twins know things, that they had only had to live the whole long proof of it before they could say it out loud, and that anyway they had got there in the end, which was the thing that mattered, that they were here, together, by one fire, with the snow coming down, and that whatever the old man had divided was joined again now, in the only way that had ever mattered, and could not be divided again, not by any will or law or fortune, not by anything left in the world, but the one thing that comes for everyone, and that was not to be feared, not here, not by this fire, not with a sister's hand in your own. The grandchildren took to Adelaide at once, with the easy unweighing love of children, and it was perhaps they, more than anything, who finished the long work of thawing her. They had been told that their great-aunt was the rich sad lady from the great house up the river, and they had come prepared to be a little afraid of her, and they found instead a gentle grey old woman who listened to everything they said as if it mattered, who had endless patience for their games, who had never, it turned out, had any children of her own, and so received theirs with a wonder that the children found delightful and could not understand. They climbed into her lap and showed her their small treasures, and taught her the games she had never been allowed to learn, and Adelaide, who had sat childless in the great cold house for 50 years, found herself at the very end of her life surrounded by children who wanted nothing from her but herself, and she loved them with a fierce late tenderness, and was loved back freely, and could scarcely believe that the world held anything so simple and so sweet. Esther set her sister gently to learning the small arts of an ordinary life, the things the great house had never permitted, and it became a quiet joy between them, the teaching and the learning. She showed Adelaide how to take a slip from a plant and coax it into root, the very thing Pruitt had shown Esther 60 years before, and Adelaide, whose hands had never in her life done anything more useful than turn the pages of a book or sign a paper an agent brought her, found a deep plain pleasure in the dirt under her nails and the small green life answering her care. She showed her how to knead a loaf, and the two old women would stand together in the small kitchen, with flour to their wrists, laughing at Adelaide's clumsiness, and the smell of the baking would fill the little house the way it had filled the kitchen at the Reach long ago, where Esther had learned it at Mrs. Dell's elbow, and Adelaide, the heir, had never once been allowed to go. They spoke, in those last years, of all the things there had never been time or safety to speak of before, the whole long story laid out between them at last by the fire, and in the speaking of it the old wounds closed over for good. They spoke of their mother, who had bought in twos and divided in halves, and they wept a little, and were glad. They spoke of the night they were born and the red wool, and they found they could even smile at it now, at the 11 minutes that had cost them so much. They forgave the old man together, not because he had earned it, but because they no longer wished to carry the weight of not forgiving him, and having forgiven him they let him go, the cold, frightened man in his cold ground, and felt themselves the lighter for it. And they spoke sometimes of nothing at all, just sat in the warm, firelit silence with a lifetime of wordless knowing between them, which was, in the end, the sweetest speaking of all. So they sat, the two of them, in the two chairs drawn close, on the winter evenings of their last years together, the fire burning low, the snow at the glass, the river running unseen and patient in the dark beyond the back window, the mother's clock keeping its quiet time on the mantel. And they did not need to talk, mostly, for they had said the things that needed saying and had a lifetime of wordless knowing. Besides, and they would sit in the warm, firelit silence, two old women who had begun as one, who had been divided by 11 minutes and a thread of red wool and an old man's cold design, and who had found their way, the long way, across 50 years and 50 miles of river, back to each other at the last, and were by the fire in the snow at the end of everything, whole again and at peace and home. It is worth sitting a while with the strangeness of it, the way a life can turn entirely on a thing so small as 11 minutes, the way the whole vast machinery of a fortune and a great house, and two long separate lives can be set in motion, by which of two babies happen to draw breath first on a snowy night. The old man had built everything on those 11 minutes, had made them the hinge of two destinies, had used them to decide which granddaughter would have the world, and which would have nothing, as if 11 minutes were a thing of weight and meaning, as if the order of two cries in a firelit room were written somewhere in the nature of things. And the 11 minutes were nothing. They were an accident, a flutter of chance, as meaningless in themselves as the toss of a coin, and the whole great edifice of consequence the old man raised upon them was raised in the end upon air. And yet the consequences were real as consequences ever are, for that is the way of the world, that the largest things grow from the smallest, that an accident becomes a fate the moment someone decides to treat it as one. The old man decided. That was the true hinge, not the 11 minutes themselves, but the cold human will that seized on them and made them mean something, that looked at two equal grandchildren and resolved to make them unequal, to give all to one and none to the other, in the name of a principle he held above the persons it would break. He could have divided the fortune fairly, as the law of his own country had long ago decided fortunes should be divided. He could have left his two granddaughters equal, as their mother had laboured to keep them. He chose not to. The 11 minutes were only his excuse. The choice was his. It is tempting to hate him for it, the cold old man with his locked safe and his clauses and his terror of division, and there were years when each of the sisters, in her own way, came close to hating him. But hatred is a heavy thing to carry, and Esther had laid hers down early, had done the hard work of refusing it, and Adelaide had laid hers down at last by the fire in the small house, and so neither of them carried it to the end, and perhaps that is the truer justice, that the man who tried so hard to bind them with his cold design was, in the end, simply let go of. Forgiven not because he deserved it, but because forgiveness is lighter to carry than its opposite, and the two sisters had decided, each in her own time, to travel light. He had wanted to be remembered as the man who kept the fortune whole. He is remembered, by the only people who remember him at all, as a sad old man who broke what mattered to save what did not, and was, at the last, gently set down and let go. For the fortune did not last, and that is the plainest verdict on the whole design. The thing the old man sacrificed everything to preserve, the great undivided Hartwell money, ebbed away in the ordinary course of time, worn down by the changing of the age, until there was nothing left of it but a modest competence and a great house no one wanted. All the cruelty had bought nothing. The disinheriting of one granddaughter and the burdening of the other had preserved, in the end, a fortune that time dissolved anyway, as time dissolves all fortunes sooner or later, whatever clauses are written to bind them. The old man had set himself against time, the great divider, and time had won, as it always wins, and the only things that survived the long contest were the things the old man had never valued and could not touch. The green line of slips and cuttings, the box of faithful letters, the love between two sisters that his whole design had been built to break. And what, in the final reckoning, had each of them truly possessed? Adelaide had possessed the fortune, the great house, the fine clothes, the deference of the world, and had possessed underneath all of it nothing, a cold, spacious emptiness, a poverty and fine clothes that she could not even name because the world would not believe it, until the very end, when she gave it all up and came down the river and possessed, for a few brief years, the only wealth that had ever been worth having, which was a sister's company by a warm fire. And Esther had possessed nothing by the world's reckoning all her life, a few $100s and a box of slips and a trunk of plain clothes, and had possessed, underneath that nothing, everything, a real life, work, and friends, and love, and children, and music, and use, the whole uncountable wealth of an ordinary life fully lived, and had known, almost all along, that she had the better portion, and had been glad of it, and had never once been able to share the knowledge with the world that pitied her. There is an old story, older than the Hartwells, older than the country, of two divine brothers who were twins, one of whom was born immortal and one mortal, so that one was given the endless life of the gods, and the other only the short, bright life of men. And the story tells that the immortal brother, when his mortal twin came to die, could not bear to be parted from him, and went to the father of the gods and begged to share his own immortality with his brother, to divide the gift, so that neither would have all and neither nothing, but both would have half and be together. It is a strange thing to set beside the story of two Gilded Age sisters by a river, and yet it is the same story, at the heart of it, the story of a gift that is no gift if it cannot be shared, and of the love that would rather divide everything than possess everything alone. The old man had forbidden the dividing, but the sisters, at the last, found their own way to share, not the fortune which was gone, but themselves, which was all that had ever mattered. They died within a season of each other, as twins so often do, the long thread that had joined them from before birth, not easily letting one go on alone for long. Esther went first, gently, in her sleep, in the small house by the river, an old woman at the end of a full life, and Adelaide, who had come so late to her sister's side, sat with her at the end and held her hand, the way they had held hands at every grave of their lives, and in the dark of the shared cradle before there were any graves at all, and was glad, even in her grief, that she had come in time, that she had not let the great house and the fortune and the long habit of separation keep her away until it was too late. And Adelaide followed before the winter was out, quietly, in the kept chair by the fire, and the people of the town buried the two sisters side by side in the small churchyard above the river, under one modest stone, together at the last, undivided as they had begun. The great house was sold and passed out of the family, and in time was something else, and the name of Hartwell faded from the valley the way names do, until there was no one left who remembered why it had ever meant anything, the mills long gone, the looms long silent, the fortune long dissolved, the cold old man and his cold design forgotten utterly. But in the small river town, for a while, people remembered the two old sisters who had walked by the water arm in arm, and the music that came from the little house of an evening, and the window-sills crowded with green, and the grandchildren who came and went, and that was the only monument either of them had, and it was a better one than the great grey house had ever been, for it was made of the thing that lasts, which is not stone and not money, but the memory of love among people who knew each other to the bone. And the green things lasted, after their own fashion, longest of all, for the grandchildren had taken their cuttings, as Esther had taught them, as Pruitt had taught her, and they grew the slips on their own sills and gave cuttings in their turn, and somewhere, perhaps, even now, in some window in some town along that river, there grows a green thing descended by long unbroken generations from the stock, an old gardener tended at a great house that no longer stands, given to a disinherited girl in a box of damp moss on the morning she walked out of her old life into a real one, carried by her through every room of a long full life, and reunited at the last with its other branch on a windowsill by a winter fire, the one inheritance in the whole long story that was never divided and never lost, passed hand to hand, sill to sill, down through the years, quietly, the way the things that truly last are always passed. So that is the story of the forgotten Hartwell twins, the one who inherited everything and the one who got nothing, and of how, in the long, slow accounting that time makes of all our arrangements, the nothing turned out to be everything, and the everything turned out to be nothing, and the two of them found their way, the long way, back to each other at the last. It is not a story with a villain in it, not really, only a frightened old man who loved a thing more than he loved his own blood and paid the price of it, and could not see, until it was far too late to matter to him, what the price had been. And it is not a story with a triumph in it, only a reconciliation, which is a quieter and a better thing, Two old women by a fire, holding hands, at peace, at the end of a long divided road, home. It's a strange word, inheritance, when you turn it over by a low fire, for it means two things that have almost nothing to do with each other. There is the inheritance the lawyers mean, the lands and the monies and the houses, the things that can be weighed and counted and written into a will, the things the old man gave whole to one granddaughter and denied entirely to the other. And there is the other inheritance, the one no will can convey or withhold, the things that pass from hand to hand without any document at all, a way of loving, a patience with small living things, a music, a habit of telling the truth on paper to the one person who will understand it. The first kind the old man controlled completely, and it came, in the end, to nothing. The second kind he could not touch, and it was everything, and it passed, despite all his clauses, exactly where it would, to the granddaughter he had cast out, and through her to her children, and through them to theirs, undivided, unkillable, going on. And there is the matter of the forgetting, which the story carries in its very name, for these were the forgotten Hartwell twins, and forgotten they are, as nearly everyone is forgotten in the long run of years. The great fortune is forgotten, that seemed to its maker a kind of immortality. The great house is forgotten, or stands now as something else, its origin a thing no one recalls. The cold old man is forgotten utterly, who wanted above all to be remembered as the keeper of an undying line. History keeps the names of a few of the very rich and loses almost everyone else, and it would have lost these two sisters entirely, the heiress and the music teacher, had not their small strange story happened to be the kind that is worth telling by a fire on a winter night, for the sake of the quiet truth folded inside it. They are forgotten, and it does not matter that they are forgotten, for the things they truly possessed were never the kind of things that history keeps. Those things they spent in the living and the spending was the having, and it was enough. Perhaps that is the only lesson in it, if a story so gentle can be said to have a lesson, which is that the things worth having are the things that cannot be inherited in the lawyer's sense, the things you have to make for yourself out of whatever you are given, even if what you're given is nothing at all, even if what you're given is everything, and it turns out to be the heavier burden of the two. The disinherited sister made a life out of her nothing, and it was full. The favoured sister was given the world and had to wait until the very end, until the fortune was gone and the great house let go, to make a life out of what was left, which was also, as it turned out, almost nothing, a borrowed chair by a small warm fire, and was also, as it turned out, enough, more than enough, everything. They came to the same place at the last, the one who had everything and the one who had nothing, the same small room, the same low fire, the same two chairs drawn close, and that, perhaps, is the truest justice the story holds and the most consoling. And it began, all of it, on a snowy night long ago, with two cries in a firelit room, 11 minutes apart, into a house that thought it knew what it was about to do, and did not, could not, for no one ever truly knows, when a life begins, what it will turn out to have been worth, or where the things that matter will turn out to have been hidden, or how long and strange the road home will prove to be. The snow fell on the great house that night, and it falls now, at the end of the telling, on the small one. The same snow, the same patient river running on in the dark, and an old woman by a low fire, and a second chair drawn close, and the long quiet after a story that has at last, after everything, come gently to its rest. And so we come back, the way we always meant to the small house at the edge of the river town, and the room with the low fire and the snow still falling past the glass, slow and wide and in no hurry at all. Nothing here needs doing now. The story has been told, and the telling is over, and there is nothing left but the warmth of the room, and the soft light of the fire, and the quiet that comes after. The good quiet, the quiet you can rest in. Let your breathing slow to the pace of the falling snow. There is all the time in the world. There is nothing left to keep. The fire has burned down to its gentle embers, and the embers shift now and then with a small soft sound, and the light they throw is warm and low and kind, the colour of the last of a long day. The clock on the mantel keeps its quiet time, not hurrying, not counting down to anything, just breathing along with the room. Outside, the snow comes down over the river and the town and the whole sleeping valley, laying itself softly over every sharp thing, every hard edge, until the world is rounded and white and still. You do not have to listen for anything. You do not have to wait for anything. You can let it all grow quiet now. There are 2 chairs by the fire drawn close, the way chairs come to sit when the people who use them have spent a great many evenings side by side and have stopped needing to say much. The story they belong to is a story of long division and long return, of 11 minutes and 50 years and 50 miles of river, of everything and nothing turning out, in the end, to be each other's opposites in disguise. But you do not need to hold any of that now. Let the story settle behind you like the snow settling on the ground, softly without a sound, covering everything over, smoothing it all away into rest. Whatever you have been carrying today, whatever has felt like too much or not enough, whatever sums you have been doing in the dark, you can set it down here, by this fire, in this warm, quiet room. You do not have to keep anything whole tonight. You do not have to hold anything against the dividing dark. You can let your hands unclench. You can let the fistful of sand run out between your fingers and find that the letting go is not a loss but a rest. The deepest rest there is. The rest of a keeper at last relieved of the keeping. The snow goes on falling, slow and soft, past the glass that holds a little of the firelight and gives it back. The embers settle. The clock breathes. The river runs on in the dark beyond the window, patient and old, carrying its grey water down past the great houses and the small ones alike, indifferent and gentle, bound for the sea. And in the warm room, by the low fire, between the 2 chairs drawn close, there is only stillness now, and warmth, and the soft falling of the snow, and the long quiet after a story that has come, at last, all the way home to rest. Rest now, let the fire burn low, let the snow keep falling, let it all grow quiet and quieter and quiet. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. And before you drift off, here is something soft to wonder about, if you wish. If you could choose, would you rather inherit a great fortune and the weight that comes with it, or be given nothing at all and left free to build a small, warm life entirely your own? There is no right answer, and no need to decide tonight. If a thought comes to you, you are welcome to leave it in the comments whenever you like. For now, just rest.